Welcome now. Before we start, I ask you to subscribe. Tell us where you're from and don't forget to leave a like. I should have listened to my gut feeling when Lucy rolled her eyes at the RV rental place. Mum, seriously, this is your idea of bonding. She had that same dismissive tone her father used to have, but I was determined to make this work. To prove that sometimes the best way to fix a broken relationship is to get away from everything familiar. The Airstream Classic looked pristine in the afternoon sun, its polished aluminum exterior reflecting the looming shadow of Mount Shasta. The rental agent, a middle-aged woman named Barbara, kept emphasizing how lucky we were to get this particular vehicle. It just came back from a complete maintenance check, she said, though something in her smile seemed forced. Perfect timing for the equinox season. The drive up the mountain started smoothly enough. Lucy had her headphones on, deliberately creating a barrier between us, while I focused on navigating the increasingly narrow roads. That's when we stopped at the last gas station before the northern camping grounds. The old attendant, he must have been in his 70s, kept staring at our RV while filling up the tank. "Ain't right," he muttered, shaking his head. "That vehicle shouldn't be heading up there. Not now, not during this time." I dismissed his warning as local superstition, but Lucy finally took her headphones off, suddenly interested. "What do you mean?" she asked him. The old man glanced nervously at the setting sun before leaning closer to her window. "That Airstream, it has a history up here. Bad things happen when it returns during the equinox. Last family that took it up." He stopped abruptly, looking past us at something in the distance. We should have turned around when the GPS started malfunctioning, sending us up an unmarked Forest Service road instead of the main campground route. The sun was setting faster than it should have, casting long shadows through the trees. The temperature inside the RV dropped unexpectedly. Enough that I could see Lucy's breath when she complained about the heater not working. That's when we first heard it. A low, rhythmic humming coming from somewhere inside the walls. Lucy said it was probably just the engine, but I'd driven enough RVs in my previous life as a happily married woman to know this wasn't normal. The sound followed us as we finally found a clearing to park for the night. A spot that seemed perfect until I noticed the strange rock formation arranged in a perfect circle around where we'd stopped. As I set up for the night, my phone lost all signal. Expected in these remote areas, what wasn't expected was the way the screen kept flashing random symbols before going completely dark. Lucy's phone did the same thing moments later. "Mom," she said, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. Maybe that old man was right. Maybe we shouldn't be here. I wanted to tell her everything would be fine, but the words caught in my throat as I noticed something through the RV's back window. Fresh scratches on the exterior, forming patterns that looked eerily like the symbols that had flashed on our phones. Symbols that shouldn't have been there, couldn't have been there when we left the rental place. The humming in the walls grew louder as darkness fell completely around us, and somewhere in the distance, just barely audible over the sound, I could swear I heard someone, or something, whispering our names. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came around midnight. Lucy had finally fallen asleep in the small bedroom at the back of the RV, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the ever-present humming in the walls. I was trying to convince myself that the old man's warnings were just local folklore when the radio suddenly came to life. At first it was just static, the kind that makes your skin crawl, but then buried beneath the white noise, I heard what sounded like a child's voice. "Mommy," it called, using Lucy's same inflection from when she was younger. I rushed to turn it off, but the power button did nothing. The voice continued, distorting into something else, something older and wrong, until it wasn't Lucy's voice anymore. The temperature inside the RV plummeted again. The heating system made a terrible grinding noise before shutting down completely. I could see frost forming on the windows. In September, the patterns it made looked deliberate, like the same symbols we'd seen on our phones, like someone was drawing them from the outside. I grabbed my flashlight and forced myself to look through the window, but the beam couldn't penetrate more than a few feet into the darkness. That's when Lucy screamed. I ran to the bedroom, finding her pressed against the wall. pointing at the ceiling. "There's something up there," she whispered. I heard it crawling around. We both stayed silent, listening. The humming in the walls had stopped, replaced by what sounded like fingernails dragging slowly across the RV's metal roof. Moving from one end to the other, then came the knocking. 3 distinct taps on every window in perfect synchronization, as if we were surrounded by people or things that had been waiting for this moment. Lucy grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Mom, look at the floor," she said. The carpet was moving, rippling like water, and underneath it, those same damn symbols were beginning to glow with a sickly green light. I tried to start the RAV, desperate to get us out of there, but the engine wouldn't turn over. Instead, the dashboard lights began flashing in a sequence, and the GPS screen displayed a message that made my blood run cold. "Welcome home, Catherine and Lucy. We've been waiting." The radio static returned, louder this time, and through it came a chorus of whispers, all speaking in unison. "The airstream remembers, the mountain remembers, you belong to both now." Lucy started crying, and I pulled her close, feeling her whole body shaking. "Mom," she sobbed, "how do they know our names?" That's when we saw it through the windshield, a tall, dark figure standing at the edge of the clearing, its form barely visible, except for the same green glow we'd seen in the symbols. It raised one impossibly long arm and pointed directly at us. The RV's metal frame groaned like it was being squeezed by an enormous hand. The figure took a step forward, and every light in the RV exploded simultaneously, showering us with sparks and plunging us into total darkness. In that moment of pitch blackness, we heard something heavy land on the roof, and a voice, not through the radio this time, but right above our heads, said, "The ceremony can finally begin." In complete darkness, the only sound was Lucy's rapid breathing and the steady drip, drip, drip of something thick hitting the RV's roof. Each drop made a sound too heavy to be rain, too rhythmic to be natural. My flashlight was dead. My phone was dead, and even the emergency lights had failed. We were blind, but we weren't alone. "We need to run," I whispered to Lucy, pulling her toward where I remembered the door being. But when my hand touched the handle, it was burning hot. I yanked it back with a yelp, feeling my skin blister. Above us, whatever had landed on the roof shifted its weight, making the entire RV creak. That's when we smelled it. A sickly sweet odor like burning herbs mixed with decay. The green symbols beneath the carpet pulsed brighter, casting just enough light to see that the walls were breathing. The metal surface rippled like living tissue, and in certain spots, it looked like faces were trying to push their way through. Lucy saw them too and started screaming. I clamped my hand over her mouth, but it was too late. "The daughters have awakened," multiple voices chanted from outside the RV. The temperature dropped so low that our breath came out in clouds of frost. Through the windshield, we could see more of those tall figures gathering in the clearing, their bodies seeming to float just above the ground. They were all pointing at the RV, and with each gesture, the symbols glowed brighter. I remembered the emergency exit window in the bathroom. It was small, but we might be able to squeeze through. I grabbed Lucy's hand and started pulling her toward the back of the RV. Each step was agony. The floor had become so cold it felt like walking on ice. Behind us, I heard the main door slowly creaking open. Though neither of us had touched it, we made it to the bathroom. But when I looked in the mirror, I saw dozens of faces reflected back, all of them women and young girls, their expressions frozen in terror. Lucy gasped, "Mom, they're all the ones who came before us. Look at their clothes. They're from different times." I started working on the emergency window while Lucy watched the bathroom door. The latch was stuck, covered in the same symbols that now seemed to be spreading across every surface of the RV. As I struggled with it, a voice whispered directly into my ear, "The mountain needs daughters. The airstream brings daughters. The cycle continues." The bathroom door slammed shut on its own. Trapping us in the tiny space, the faces in the mirror began to move, their mouths opening in silent screams. The walls started closing in, the ceiling lowering. And that's when we realized the RV wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it was digesting us. Lucy found an old iron flashlight under the sink and smashed the window. The glass shattered, but instead of fresh air, a thick, black liquid started pouring in. It moved against gravity, crawling up our legs like it had a mind of its own. Through the broken window, we could see that we weren't in the clearing anymore. The Arv was now perched on the edge of a massive cave entrance that definitely hadn't been there before. The liquid reached our waists when Lucy screamed, "Mom, it's pulling me." I grabbed her arms, but something on the other side was stronger as she was dragged toward the broken window. I saw them, hundreds of pale hands reaching through the dark liquid, all wearing the same silver bracelet Lucy had noticed at the rental place, the one Barbara had insisted she take as a welcome gift. I pulled Lucy back with all my strength, fighting against the dozens of pale hands trying to drag her through the window. The black liquid had reached our chests, and each ripple revealed more faces beneath its surface. All women, all wearing expressions of absolute terror. The bracelet on Lucy's wrist was glowing now, the same sickly green as the symbols that covered the RV's walls. "Mom, it's burning!" Lucy screamed, trying to rip the bracelet off. But the more she struggled, the tighter it became. The silver metal began to melt into her skin, and that's when the visions started. We both saw them, flashes of every mother and daughter who had ever been in this RV, each pair drawn to Mount Shasta by an irresistible urge to reconnect. Barbara's face appeared in the liquid, but different, younger. From decades ago, she was running through these same woods with her own mother, trying to escape the RV. The cycle must continue. Her voice echoed around us. Two must enter, one must remain. A daughter becomes a mother joins the mountain. The truth hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just a haunted RV. It was a trap, designed to bring mothers and daughters to whatever lived inside Mount Shasta. The rental agency, the route, even our failed relationship that made this trip seem necessary. It had all been orchestrated for generations. The mountain had been collecting daughters, turning them into mothers, who would bring the next generation. Through the broken window, the cave entrance began to glow. Inside, we could see what looked like a massive chamber filled with RVs from different eras, each one partially absorbed into the cave walls. Women's faces pushed through the organic-looking metal, their features twisted in eternal screams. At the center of it all stood an ancient airstream, its surface completely covered in the same symbols that were now burning themselves into our skin. "It's time to choose," the voices chanted. The black liquid started moving with purpose, trying to separate us. That's when I noticed all the faces in the liquid were mothers. The daughters' faces were in the walls, preserved in the metal. The mountain didn't just want sacrifices, it wanted replacements. Lucy's bracelet pulsed brighter, and she cried out in pain, "Mum, I can hear them in my head. They're showing me what I'll become." Her eyes had started to glow with that same green light, and I could see the symbols beginning to spread up her arm from the bracelet. The Arv shuddered violently, and the bathroom door burst open. The tall figures from outside were inside now, their forms clearer. They were impossibly tall women, their bodies made of the same shifting black liquid that was filling the room. Each one wore a necklace made of small silver bracelets. "Every daughter becomes a mother," they spoke in unison. "Every mother becomes one with the mountain. Choose, Catherine Reynolds. Take your place among us, or watch your daughter take yours." The liquid rose to our necks, and I could feel it trying to pull us apart. Through the window, I saw more RVs driving up the mountain road in the distance, each one carrying another mother and daughter pair. Drawn by the same false promise of reconciliation that had brought us here, Lucy's grip on my hand was weakening, the symbols now covering half her body. I had seconds to make a choice that would determine both our fates, and I realized with horror that every mother before me had faced this same terrible decision. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. As a mother, I had spent 16 years putting Lucy first, and I wasn't about to stop now. I pulled her close, feeling the black liquid trying to separate us, and yanked the silver bracelet from her wrist with all my strength. The metal seared my flesh as I took it. but the symbols immediately began crawling up my arm instead of hers. No, the voices shrieked in unison. The daughter must choose, the cycle must continue. But they had made one crucial mistake. In all their years of collecting mothers and daughters, they had never encountered someone who knew their own daughter was stronger than they were. Lucy didn't need my protection anymore. She needed me to trust her. "Lucy!" I shouted over the chaos. "The mirrors! All these RVs, they're like mirrors, reflecting the mountain's power." Understanding flashed in her eyes, while I had been seeing horror in all those reflected faces. My brilliant daughter had been seeing patterns, connections, weaknesses. She grabbed the iron flashlight she had used to break the window and smashed the bathroom mirror. The effect was instant. The black liquid recoiled as if in pain, and the tall figures flickered like bad television reception. The faces in the walls began to distort, the metal rippling violently. "Every mother becomes one with the mountain," Lucy said, her voice stronger than I'd ever heard it. "But what if the mountain can't hold any more?" She started scraping the symbols off the walls with the broken mirror, breaking their perfect patterns. Each destroyed symbol sent shockwaves through the entire RV. The ancient airstream in the cave started to pulse erratically, its symbols flickering. The mountain itself began to tremble. I realized what had to be done and pressed my symbol-covered arm against the wall, letting the infection of ancient marks spread from me into the RV's metal skin. But instead of completing their pattern, I let my chaos in. All the pain of divorce, the messy reality of real relationships, the imperfect love that was stronger than any ritual. The tall figures lunged for us, but Lucy was faster. She swung the iron flashlight in an arc, shattering every reflective surface she could reach. Each break sent cracks through reality itself. And through those cracks, we could see the truth. The mountain wasn't collecting daughters to continue some eternal cycle. It was trying to rebuild something it had lost eons ago, using the bond between mothers and daughters as a template, creating a twisted mirror of real human connection. The walls of the RV began to tear apart, and through the gaps, we saw the other vehicles in the cave collapsing. The faces trapped in the metal were changing, no longer screaming, but smiling. They were becoming photographs, memories, echoes of women who could finally rest. "Mom." Lucy grabbed my hand as the floor buckled beneath us. The black liquid was draining away, pulling the tall figures with it. They weren't reaching for us anymore. They were reaching for each other, their forms dissolving into what they truly were, fragments of a single entity, an ancient thing that had forgotten that real bonds can't be forced or replicated. We ran through the disintegrating RV, past the collapsing cave, into the cold mountain air. Behind us, the ground swallowed decades' worth of trapped vehicles. The rental office's lights went dark in the distance. The mountain gave one final shudder, and in the silence that followed, we heard something that sounded almost like a thank you. 3 days later, they found us walking down the mountain road. The official report blamed a sinkhole for swallowing the old rental office and its mysterious owner. They never found Barbara, but sometimes on cold nights, I swear I can hear her voice on the radio, finally at peace. The silver bracelet left a scar on my arm in the shape of a broken circle. Lucy says it looks like a chain being pulled apart. She's probably right. She usually is. We don't need cursed RVs or ancient rituals to work on our relationship. Sometimes, the scariest thing you can do is trust that the bond between mother and daughter is stronger when it's real, messy, and chosen freely every single day. But if you're ever driving near Mount Shasta and see an Airstream dealership run by a woman who seems too eager to help mothers and daughters reconnect, keep driving. Some bonds don't need to be tested by darkness to prove they're unbreakable. They just need to be real. I should have listened to the old man at the gas station. His weathered face and trembling hands should have been warning enough, but I was too focused on getting the perfect shot. "Miss, you don't want to take that RAV up there, not with the storm coming," he had said, his eyes darting nervously toward Mount Rushmore's distant silhouette. "Strange things happen up there when the snow falls." The Airstream flying cloud hummed steadily as I navigated the winding road. my camera equipment safely stowed in the cabinet above the small dining area. The forecast had mentioned snow, but nothing severe enough to warrant concern. Besides, I had waited months for this opportunity to photograph Mount Rushmore in winter conditions. When tourist numbers dwindled and the monument took on an eerier, more imposing presence, the first snowflakes began to fall as I pulled into the deserted visitor parking area. The massive stone faces of the presidents loomed above, partially obscured by low-hanging clouds that seemed to cling to the rock like spectral hands. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, struck by how different the monument looked in person, more ancient somehow, as if the carved faces were merely a facade covering something far older. That's when I first heard it. A low, rhythmic drumming carried on the wind. I initially dismissed it as the sound of construction work somewhere in the park, but there were no other vehicles in sight, and according to the website, all maintenance work had been suspended for the season. The drumming faded away as quickly as it had come, leaving behind an unsettling silence broken only by the soft patter of snow against the RV's metal roof. I spent the next hour setting up my mobile home for the night, grateful that I had splurged on the top-of-the-line model with its efficient heating system and reinforced weather protection. The park ranger who processed my overnight parking permit had been surprisingly reluctant to approve it, mumbling something about restricted areas and traditional grounds. But my press credentials and a few well-placed calls to my editor had eventually won me authorization. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped dramatically and the snow began to fall in earnest. I sat at my small desk, reviewing the day's test shots on my laptop, when movement caught my eye through the window. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing among the trees, tall, unnaturally still, and wearing what looked like traditional Native American ceremonial dress. But when I grabbed my camera and hurried to the door, there was nothing there except swirling snow and lengthening shadows. That should have been my second warning, but instead, I simply added it to my shot list for tomorrow. Capturing the play of light and shadow on the monument at dawn, I had no idea that by dawn, my entire world would be turned upside down. I woke up to complete darkness and bitter cold. The RV's heating system had failed sometime during the night, though I distinctly remembered setting it to full power before going to bed. The digital thermostat was dead, its display as black as the winter night outside. When I tried the lights, nothing happened. Even my fully charged phone showed no signal. Not unusual in remote locations, but I'd had 4 bars when I'd checked my emails just hours earlier. The drumming had returned. Louder this time, it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating through the RV's metal frame. I fumbled for my flashlight and swept its beam across the window. The snow had piled up considerably, coating everything in a thick white blanket that reflected the light with an almost unnatural intensity. But what made my blood run cold was the set of footprints leading up to my RV. Bare footprints in the deep snow, as if someone had walked through the blizzard without shoes. Something moved in my peripheral vision. A dark shape passing by the bathroom window. I swung my flashlight toward it, but the beam flickered and died, plunging me back into darkness. In that moment of absolute blackness, I heard something scratch against the RV's exterior. Not the random tapping of ice or tree branches, but deliberate, like fingers dragging slowly across metal. The emergency generator kicked in with a whine, and dim light flooded the cabin. I rushed to check the security cameras I'd installed earlier, but the footage showed only static. As I adjusted the settings, trying to clear up the image, the static briefly cleared. What I saw made my heart stop. Dozens of figures standing in a circle around my RV, their forms barely visible through the swirling snow. They appeared to be wearing traditional Native American ceremonial dress, but their features were wrong, distorted, as if their faces were melting into the darkness. When I looked out the windows again, there was nothing there, but the footprints remained, and now they had multiplied, creating a complex pattern in the snow that reminded me of the ancient petroglyphs I'd researched before this trip. As I studied them, the patterns seemed to shift and change, forming symbols that made my eyes hurt and my head spin when I tried to focus on them. My laptop suddenly powered on by itself, its screen filling with a cascade of error messages. Among the garbled text, one phrase kept repeating, "Sacred ground defiled." The words flashed faster and faster until the screen cracked. A spider web of fractures spreading out from the center like skeletal fingers reaching for the edges. In the broken screen's reflection, I saw something standing behind me. A tall, dark figure wearing an antlered headdress. But when I spun around, the RV was empty. I was alone. But the feeling of being watched had intensified to an almost unbearable degree. The RV's engine refused to start. Each turn of the key produced only a sickening, grinding noise that sounded nothing like the reliable purr I was used to. Outside, the snow had become a solid wall of white. But through it, I could see the president's faces on Mount Rushmore. They looked different now, distorted. Their stone expressions twisted into grotesque grins that seemed to mock my growing panic. I tried the radio, desperate for any contact with the outside world. Instead of static or local stations, it picked up what sounded like chanting in a language I didn't recognize. The voices grew louder, accompanied by that same rhythmic drumming from before. Suddenly, the chanting stopped, replaced by a single voice that spoke in perfect English. "You have awakened them, Emma Collins. They have waited 97 years." The temperature inside the RV plummeted so rapidly that frost began forming on the windows. From the inside, my breath came out in thick white clouds as I watched in horror as invisible fingers began writing in the frost. Names appeared, dozens of them in different handwriting styles. I recognized some from my research, names of Native American leaders who had opposed the creation of Mount Rushmore, who had warned about disturbing this sacred ground. A thunderous crack echoed through the valley, and I watched through the windshield as a new fissure appeared in the face of the mountain, running between Washington and Jefferson like a gaping wound. Dark shapes began emerging from the crack, moving with an unnatural fluidity that made my mind recoil. They flowed down the mountain face like living shadows, leaving trails of frost in their wake. Panic finally overtook me. I grabbed my emergency pack and burst out of the RV into the biting cold. The snow crunched under my boots, but it wasn't the normal sound of packed snow. It sounded like whispers. Thousands of them growing louder with each step I took. The figures I'd seen descending the mountain were nowhere in sight, but I could feel them watching, closing in from all sides. I made it about 50 yards before I realized my mistake. The swirling snow had completely disoriented me, and I no longer knew which direction led back to the main road. The drumming had reached a fever pitch, and now it seemed to be coming from beneath my feet. The ground itself began to vibrate, and cracks appeared in the snow-covered earth, revealing not soil or rock beneath, but an intricate network of symbols that glowed with a sickly green light. The symbols beneath the snow pulsed with an otherworldly rhythm. Forming a perfect circle around me, I realized with growing horror that I hadn't been wandering randomly. Something had been guiding my steps, leading me exactly where it wanted me. The ground gave way beneath my feet, and I found myself sliding down into darkness. The glowing symbols now appearing on the walls of what seemed to be an ancient tunnel. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber beneath Mount Rushmore, its walls covered in petroglyphs that seemed to move in the dim, greenish light. At the center stood a stone altar, weathered by time but unmistakably still in use. Fresh offerings lay scattered around it, modern items, phones, cameras, car keys, all covered in a thick layer of frost. With a sickening realization, I noticed they all had one thing in common. They belonged to photographers and tourists who had gone missing in the park over the years. The antlered figure I'd seen reflected in my laptop screen materialized before me. But this time it wasn't alone. The air shimmered with dozens of similar entities, each wearing ceremonial garb from different Native American nations, but these weren't spirits of the tribes. They were something else, something that had been here long before humans walked these lands. Entities that the original inhabitants had tried to keep bound through their rituals and warnings. "You seek to capture our domain with your machines," the central figure spoke, its voice resonating through my bones. "Each image taken feeds our strength. Each flash of light weakens the barriers." The being gestured toward the carved faces above, and through some impossible angle, I could see the monument from below. Not just the famous faces, but the entire network of supernatural bindings that had been inadvertently created during its construction. The truth hit me like a physical blow. Mount Rushmore hadn't been just a monument to presidents. Its construction had accidentally created a massive seal, trapping these ancient entities. But modern technology, particularly the constant documentation and photography of the site, was gradually weakening that seal. My presence here, with my high-end camera equipment and determination to capture the perfect shot, had been the final strain on their prison. The chamber began to shake, and the entities moved in perfect synchronization. Beginning what looked like an elaborate ceremonial dance, my fingers fumbled with my phone, desperately trying to turn on its flashlight. I'd read somewhere that these beings, like many supernatural creatures, were vulnerable to pure light. But as I raised my phone, all the devices scattered around the altar suddenly activated at once. Their screens glowing brightly, their cameras flashing in a terrifying strobe effect that illuminated the chamber in bursts of harsh light. The flashing devices created a chaotic pattern of light and shadow, momentarily disorienting the entities. In that crucial moment of confusion, I noticed something extraordinary. Their movements weren't just a dance. They were recreating the symbolic patterns I'd seen in the snow above. Each flash of light revealed their true forms, ancient beings of pure darkness, wearing the ceremonial garb as a mockery of the people who had once kept them bound. I remembered the research I'd done about the construction of Mount Rushmore, about the protests from Native American tribes. They hadn't just been fighting against the desecration of their sacred land. They had been trying to prevent this, to maintain the original seals that had kept these entities contained for millennia. The presidential faces weren't just carved into the mountain. They were carved with specific proportions, unknowingly creating a new type of seal when the old ones were destroyed. Acting on pure instinct, I began positioning the flashing devices to mirror the pattern of the president's faces above. The entities shrieked, a sound that existed somewhere between the screech of granite being carved and the wail of 1,000 winter winds. The chamber's temperature dropped even further, thick ice forming on every surface, but I kept moving, completing the pattern. The antlered figure lunged at me, its form shifting between solid and shadow. The ground beneath the altar cracked open, revealing a pit of swirling darkness. The entities were being pulled back into their prison, but they weren't going quietly. The chamber began collapsing, and I ran for the tunnel entrance, dodging falling rocks and grasping shadows. I could feel them right behind me, their cold breath on my neck, their whispers promising power and knowledge. If I would just turn around, just take one more photograph. I emerged from the tunnel into the blinding light of dawn. The snow had stopped, and Mount Rushmore stood silent above me. The president's face is once again serene and normal, but I knew better now. I ran back to my RV, which miraculously started on the first try as I sped away from the parking area. I glanced in my rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw them all. The entities standing in a line before the monument, the antlered figure raising its hand in what could have been a wave or a warning. That's why I'm writing this now. From a motel hundreds of miles away, my cameras are destroyed. My laptop is fried, but I had to leave this warning. Don't take pictures of Mount Rushmore in winter. Don't park your RV in the overnight lot. And if you hear drums or see strange patterns in the snow, run. Run as fast as you can. Those faces carved in the mountain aren't just watching, they're keeping something in. Something that sees each photograph, each image, as another crack in its prison, and it's getting closer to breaking free. Post found on a camping forum, user account deleted shortly after posting. Park rangers report an unusual number of camera malfunctions and electronic device failures near Mount Rushmore during winter months. The GPS died 3 hours ago, somewhere after I passed the last ranger station. Not that it mattered. The old Forest Service road I was following wasn't on any digital map anyway. According to the local environmental activists I'd interviewed, this section of Redwood National Park contained some of the oldest trees in the region. Giants that had been growing here since before the Roman Empire fell. perfect for my documentary on climate change's impact on ancient forests. My Forest River Cherokee handled the rough terrain surprisingly well, though the branches of thousand-year-old trees scraped against its sides like skeletal fingers. The morning fog was unusually thick for mid-afternoon, creating a claustrophobic tunnel of white that my headlights barely penetrated. The massive trunks of the sequoias emerged from the mist like ancient monoliths, their tops disappearing into the impenetrable gray above. The first strange thing I noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet you'd expect in a forest, but a complete absence of sound. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of wind through branches. The only noise came from my RV's engine and the crunch of dead leaves beneath its tires. I checked my audio equipment, wondering if something had malfunctioned, but the meters showed they were picking up sound. There just wasn't any to record. I found what seemed like a suitable clearing to set up camp. Though clearing might be too generous a term, it was more like a gap between the massive sequoias, barely wide enough for my RV, as I set up my main camera on its tripod. I noticed something odd about the trees surrounding me. They formed an almost perfect circle. I've spent enough time in forests to know that trees don't naturally grow in such precise geometric patterns. The fog grew thicker as I worked, and my cameras started acting up. The footage would glitch whenever I panned across certain trees, creating strange artifacts in the image. In one clip, I could swear I saw something moving in the background, a massive shadowy figure that seemed to step behind a trunk just as the camera reached it. When I played it back, frame by frame, there was nothing there. That's when I heard it. A deep, resonant sound, more felt than heard, like the groaning of wood under impossible pressure. I thought at first it was just the natural settling of the ancient trees, until I realized it had a pattern to it, almost like speech. The fog swirled and thickened, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw faces in the bark of the sequoias, not carved, but formed by the natural patterns of the wood. All of them turned toward my RV, but it was what I saw when reviewing the day's footage that made my blood run cold. In the background of every shot, no matter which direction I had pointed the camera, the same tree appeared. I know it was the same one because of its distinctive gnarled branch pattern, but that's impossible. I'd been filming in a complete circle. That tree couldn't have been in every shot unless it had moved. Night fell with unnatural speed, as if the fog had somehow devoured the remaining daylight. Inside my RV, I obsessively reviewed the footage, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. The moving tree wasn't the only anomaly. In every recording, the background seemed to shift subtly between frames, like the entire forest was playing some kind of cosmic shell game. When my camera blinked, the temperature dropped dramatically, and my breath came out in visible puffs despite the RV's heater running at full blast. A thin layer of frost began forming on the windows. On the inside, as I wiped it away, I noticed dark spots in the fog outside, roughly human-shaped, but impossibly tall, moving between the trees. My cameras picked up nothing but static when pointed at them. Something scraped against the RV's roof. A long, slow drag that sounded like wooden fingers. The entire vehicle creaked as weight pressed down from above. Through the skylight, I could see what looked like roots or vines, but they moved with deliberate purpose, probing the edges of the glass. I quickly covered it with a blanket, but not before noticing that these roots had patterns that looked disturbingly like faces. The environmental sensors I'd set up earlier to monitor air quality and temperature started spitting out impossible readings. The oxygen levels fluctuated wildly, and the electromagnetic field detector was going haywire. Most disturbing was the carbon dating unit I'd brought to study soil samples. It kept displaying ages far older than the Earth itself. As if time had no meaning here, my satellite phone chirped, making me jump. There was no way I should have had service out here. The message displayed was just a series of symbols that looked like ancient tree rings, but they seemed to move and rearrange themselves as I watched. The phone's screen cracked in a pattern that perfectly matched the symbols, and then it died completely. A deep rumble shook the ground, and I watched in horror as the trees around my RV began to move, not swaying in the wind, but actually shifting their positions, their massive roots tearing free of the earth with sounds like ancient bones breaking. They were closing in, forming a tighter circle. The fog between their trunks took on solid shapes. Tall, humanoid figures with bodies made of bark and branches. Their faces twisted copies of the patterns I'd seen in the tree rings. Through my camera's viewfinder, I saw something even more terrifying. Layers of reality peeling back like old bark. Beyond the trees, in the spaces between seconds captured by my camera, stood an impossibly vast chamber of living wood, filled with preserved bodies of other unfortunate visitors to this part of the forest. Each one was partially absorbed into a tree, their faces frozen in expressions of awe and terror. Becoming one with the ancient grove, the Arv's metal frame groaned as roots began to wrap around it, their strength slowly crushing the vehicle like a massive serpentine grip. I frantically gathered my equipment, shoving hard drives and cameras into my backpack. The footage was my only evidence, my only chance of warning others, if I survived to show it. Through my night vision camera, I watched in horror as the nearest sequoia's bark split open like a vertical mouth, revealing glowing green sap that pulsed like blood through transparent veins. The tree rings inside weren't just circles, they were words, an ancient language spiraling from the core to the bark, telling a story I couldn't read but somehow understood in my bones. These weren't trees at all, but vessels, prisons for something that had been here long before the first seed took root. My main camera's screen showed something my eyes couldn't see. Between the trees, transparent membranes stretched like cobwebs made of amber sap, and within them, preserved like insects in ancient resin, were dozens of people, hitchhikers, photographers, researchers, all caught by the forest over decades, their bodies feeding the endless hunger of these ancient beings. Their cameras and equipment were there too, half absorbed into the living wood. Still trying to document their own demise, a deep voice resonated through the RV, speaking in the language of tree rings and root systems. Your kind always returns. With your machines that capture light and time, you think you document us, but we document you, preserve you, make you part of our eternal growth. The voice seemed to come from everywhere. The trees, the fog, even the ground itself. Each word made the sap pulse brighter in the veined bark. I remembered what the activist had told me, the detail I'd dismissed as environmentalist metaphor. The oldest trees don't just record history, they feed on it. Now I understood. Every photograph taken here, every video recorded, every moment captured became part of their collection. Another ring in their endless growth, and they were hungry for more. Something massive moved in the fog beyond my Arv's windows. Not a tree this time, but a figure assembled from countless smaller branches and roots, wearing a crown of ancient bark that spiraled with those same written rings. It reached for my vehicle with hands made of twisting roots, each finger longer than a person. The Arv's metal skin began to bubble and transform wherever the roots touched it, turning into something organic, alive, and hungry. That's when I noticed something in my camera's viewfinder, a pattern in the tree rings that repeated across all the sequoias, visible only through the digital enhancement of my lens. It looked like a spiral, but contained within it was a sequence, a code that might be the key to understanding what these things were, and how to escape them. The camera's screen flickered with interference, but the pattern was becoming clearer. The tree rings weren't just recording time, they were recording data, like some kind of organic hard drive. Each ring contained fragments of memories from those the forest had absorbed. Through my viewfinder, I could see flashes of their final moments. A hiker from 1983, a botanist from 1995, a group of students from 2007, all now part of the living archive. The massive figure outside pressed against my RV, its crown of ancient bark scraping the roof. Your technology evolves, but we remain. Each new way you find to capture images only makes us stronger. As if to demonstrate, it reached toward my backup camera. The device sparked and transformed, its metal and plastic components twisting into wooden approximations of their former shapes. creating a horrific hybrid of technology and organic matter. That's when I noticed something crucial in the footage. Whenever my camera's flash fired, the wooden giant recoiled slightly. The discovery came at a cost. Every electronic device that captured its image was slowly being corrupted, their components transforming into twisted wooden versions of themselves. But in that corruption, I saw a pattern. The transformation always started at the memory cards, as if the entity was specifically targeting the stored data. We are the original archive. The voice resonated through the transformed metal of the RV. Before your kind learned to write, we were recording. Before you built your first city, we were collecting every story, every death, every moment, preserved in our rings. The walls of my RV were now almost completely organic, pulsing with the same sap-filled veins I'd seen in the trees. Through them, I could see fragments of memories from countless victims, their experiences being absorbed and archived. My hands trembled as I connected the pieces. The forest wasn't just preserving these people, it was feeding on their recorded memories, using modern technology to enhance its ancient collection. Each photograph, each video, each digital file was like a concentrated dose of human experience, far richer than anything it could absorb naturally. We hadn't been documenting the forest, we'd been feeding it. As this realization hit me, my main camera began to smoke, its circuitry overloading as the wooden transformation reached its processor. But in its dying display, I saw something incredible. When played backwards, the footage revealed a hidden pattern in the tree rings, a recursion that looked almost like a piece of corrupt computer code. If the forest was operating like a data storage system, then maybe, just maybe, it could experience something every digital archivist fears: catastrophic data corruption. With trembling hands, I reached for my last remaining piece of equipment, a prototype electromagnetic pulse generator I'd brought to test its effects on the soil sampling equipment. The wooden giant's fingers were almost through the RV's roof now, reaching for me with purpose, ready to add my memories to its eternal archive. I had one chance, one desperate theory about how to crash the world's oldest organic database. The EMP generator hummed in my hands, its charging indicator the only artificial light left in the now organic cavity that had been my RV. I had one shot at this. If my theory was wrong, I'd join the countless others in the forest's living archive. The wooden giant's fingers had fully penetrated the roof, dripping luminescent sap that formed new memory-filled rings wherever it fell. Your device cannot harm us. The forest's voice resonated through the transformed walls. We predate your electricity, your digital memories. But I wasn't trying to harm it. I was trying to corrupt it. Like any database, even one made of living wood and ancient memories, it had to have rules, patterns, a structure that could be broken. I activated all my remaining cameras simultaneously, pointing them at different trees through the gaps in the dissolving RV walls. Each device was already half transformed, their displays showing impossible images, centuries of archived memories bleeding together. The forest entity seemed to grow stronger, with each new image captured, its wooden form swelling as it absorbed the digital data. That's when I triggered the EMP. The blast wasn't massive, but it did exactly what I'd hoped. It corrupted every piece of digital equipment simultaneously, sending broken, scrambled data into the forest's living archive system. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The tree rings began to blur and shift, their careful patterns of stored memories disrupting like a hard drive. Experiencing a power surge during a write operation, the wooden giant reeled back, its form destabilizing as corrupted data spread through the network of sap-filled veins connecting all the trees. Centuries of perfectly preserved memories began to fragment and cross-contaminate. I watched through my last dying camera as the impossible happened. The forest's organic database began to experience a cascade failure. "What have you done?" The voice was no longer singular, but a chorus of corrupted memories, each tree experiencing its own version of a system crash. The perfectly geometric circle of sequoias began to twist and contort, their rings scrambling like scratched CDs trying to play corrupted files. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed my backup drive, the only device that had been powered down during the EMP, and ran. Behind me, the forest was in chaos, trees thrashing as their stored memories collapsed into digital entropy. The fog that had been so thick and purposeful now swirled randomly, its conscious patterns broken. I ran until my lungs burned, following the old Forest Service road by moonlight. When I finally reached my car at the ranger station, the sun was rising in my rearview mirror. I could see the fog had lifted from that section of the forest, revealing the sequoias standing innocent and still, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. Their data had been corrupted, their archive temporarily scrambled. That's why I'm sharing this footage from my backup drive now, from a coffee shop hundreds of miles away. The forest will eventually defrag itself, restore its archived memories from redundant rings, and resume its collection. But now we know its weakness. We know that even the oldest of natural databases can experience data corruption. Don't go to the unmapped sections of Redwood National Park. Don't take your cameras, your phones, or any device that can record memories. The forest is hungry for new data to replace what it lost. I should have known something was wrong when my camera started capturing things that weren't there. As a professional extreme weather photographer, I've documented everything from 60 degrees in Antarctica to sandstorms in the Sahara. But Death Valley during this unprecedented heat wave was different. The air itself seemed to have a weight to it, a presence I couldn't explain. My Winnebago Vista was equipped with the best cooling system money could buy, yet the dashboard thermometer kept fluctuating wildly. 55 degree 1 minute, 30 deg the next, then shooting up to impossible readings like 80 deg. I initially blamed it on the electronics failing in the heat. You expect equipment problems in these conditions. What you don't expect is to see people walking through your viewfinder in a restricted area of Death Valley where no one should be. The first anomaly appeared in a simple landscape shot, a figure standing perfectly still among the salt flats, wearing what looked like Victorian-era clothing. When I checked with my naked eye, there was nothing there. I deleted the photo, convinced it was sensor damage from the heat, but then it happened again and again. Each time the figures became clearer, more numerous, and they seemed to be looking directly at my camera. By sunset, I had parked my RV at Furnace Creek Campground, or at least that's where my GPS claimed I was. But the coordinates on my phone showed me simultaneously at Badwater Basin, Zabriskie Point, and 3 other locations across the park. I double-checked my navigation system, ran diagnostics, even tried my backup GPS unit. According to every device I had, I was somehow existing in 5 different places at once. That night, as I reviewed the day's photos on my laptop, I noticed something that made my blood run cold despite the oppressive heat. In each successive photo, the figures weren't just appearing, they were getting closer to my camera's position. And in the last photo I took before sunset, one of them was looking directly into my lens with eyes that seemed to reflect light in impossible ways, its mouth open in what could have been a smile or a threat. I'm writing this now because people need to know what's happening here. The heat isn't just breaking records, it's breaking reality itself. And these things, whatever they are, they've noticed us watching them. If you're reading this and planning a trip to Death Valley, especially with an RV, stay away. The things I've seen through my camera lens, they're starting to appear even without it now, shimmering in the heat distortions outside my windows. The first file appeared on my phone at 3:47 a.m. A PDF document I never downloaded, written in what looked like Sanskrit but translated itself into English as I watched. My phone's screen kept glitching, displaying fragments of coordinates and warnings that made my stomach turn. The air conditioning in my RV had stopped working hours ago, but the temperature inside was now dropping to near freezing levels. I couldn't get a signal out, but somehow my devices were receiving data from unknown sources. My camera's memory card filled itself with thousands of photos I never took, each showing the same location in Death Valley but from different time periods. Some seemed to be from centuries ago. Others looked like they were taken in possible futures, in one particularly disturbing image. My own RV appeared, but it was aged decades, partially buried in salt crystals that couldn't have formed in a human lifetime. The GP system went completely haywire, showing that I was moving at 100 mph while my RV was clearly parked. The navigation screen displayed a map I didn't recognize. The topography of Death Valley was there, but overlaid with geometric patterns that pulsed and shifted like a living thing. That's when I noticed that the patterns matched the movements of the shadowy figures outside, as if the map was tracking them instead of human landmarks. Around dawn, my laptop turned itself on and began downloading files from an impossible network connection. Documents, images, and video clips flooded my screen. Research papers about dimensional rifts, classified military reports about disappearances in Death Valley dating back to the 1800s, and thermal imaging studies showing temperature patterns that defied physics. All of these files had one thing in common. They were created weeks or months in the future. The most terrifying discovery came when I checked my camera's display screen. The photos were changing. The figures weren't just getting closer anymore. They were slowly turning to face the camera in every single image. Even ones I took hours ago in the most recent photos, they had moved so close that I could see details I wish I hadn't. Their skin rippled like heat waves, and their eyes reflected light in multiple colors that shouldn't exist in our visible spectrum. Then my RV's electrical system began to respond to their presence. Lights flickered in patterns that matched their movements, and the radio cycled through frequencies automatically, picking up fragments of voices speaking in languages that hurt my ears. The voices began forming words I could understand, repeating the same phrase over and over. The heat breaks the walls between. Your images open the door. We have waited so long. The first physical manifestation happened at noon, when the heat distortion outside my RV's windows began to solidify into shapes. I watched, paralyzed, as what I thought was a mirage transformed into a tall, elongated figure that moved like rippling water. My camera started taking photos by itself, its shutter clicking rapidly despite being powered off, and with each click, the figure became more substantial. I tried to start the RV, but the engine responded with an impossible sound. The roar of the motor played in reverse, as if time itself was malfunctioning. Through the windshield, I could see the desert landscape fracturing like broken glass, each segment showing a different version of Death Valley. In one fragment, it was night. In another, the salt flats were covered in vast geometric structures that shifted and changed as I watched. The temperature gauge on my weather equipment displayed readings in impossible sequences. 70°, 120°, and symbols that weren't numbers at all. When I attempted to back the RV away from the approaching figure, the wheels spun on salt crystals that grew and multiplied beneath them like living things. The GPS screen showed my location spiraling through coordinates that shouldn't exist on Earth. Then they breached the barrier. It started with a hand, if you could call it that, pressing through the air next to my driver's side window as if pushing through a membrane. The appendage rippled with colors that hurt my eyes, and where it touched the RV's metal exterior, the material began to age rapidly. Developing decades of rust in seconds, I scrambled to the back of the vehicle. But every window now showed different creatures emerging from different versions of reality. My camera's memory card ejected itself, floating in midair as the photos stored within began to physically manifest around me. Each image turned into a paper-thin portal, and through each one, I could see fragments of other dimensions bleeding into ours. The beings were using my own documentation of them as doorways, turning my life's work into their means of invasion. In desperation, I smashed my camera, but this only made things worse. The broken lens shattered into shards that each reflected a different reality, and the creatures began stepping through these reflections into my RV. The air itself became thick and syrupy, time moving at different speeds throughout the vehicle's interior. In one corner, my water bottle emptied itself in reverse, while near the bathroom, my digital clock cycled through 1,000 years in seconds. The realization hit me as I watched my reflection fragment across the RV's rearview mirrors. It wasn't just my digital photos they were using. Every image I had ever captured in my memory, every mental snapshot of Death Valley I had taken since arriving, was becoming a potential gateway. The creatures were infiltrating my mind through my photographer's eye, turning my trained visual memory against me. My phone's gallery app began displaying photos I'd taken decades ago, from my very first camera to my latest assignments, but they were wrong, distorted. In every childhood photo, one of the beings stood in the background, as if they had always been there, rewriting my past through the pictures. My memories began to shift, realigning with these corrupted images, and I could feel my grip on reality weakening. That's when I found the hidden files in my phone's corrupted system. Dozens of similar accounts from other photographers, journalists and tourists, all of whom had encountered these entities in Death Valley. Their stories existed in fragments, most of them partially erased from reality, but the pattern was clear. Every victim had been someone who documented the landscape. Every single one had disappeared, their existence gradually fading from records, memories, and finally, reality itself. The ARV's electrical system surged unexpectedly, and in that burst of power, my satellite radio picked up impossible broadcasts. Distress calls from other vehicles, other photographers, separated not by distance, but by time and dimension. Some were decades old. Others seemed to be from futures that hadn't happened yet, all of them warning about the same things I was experiencing. I heard my own voice among them, from versions of myself that had already lived through this nightmare in other timelines. Using the RV's power system seemed to affect the entities. When the engine sparked or the lights flickered, they recoiled, their forms destabilizing. In desperate inspiration, I began rerouting the vehicle's electrical system, creating feedback loops that sent power surging through the metal frame. The beings retreated from the electrified walls, but the effort fried most of my equipment, including the crucial air conditioning system. As the temperature inside began to rise again, I discovered the terrible truth in the corrupted files. These creatures hadn't been imprisoned in Death Valley. They were slowly transforming it, converting our reality into their own, degree by degree. Photograph by photograph, every heat wave brought their dimension closer to ours. And my pictures hadn't just documented this process, they had accelerated it. We photographers weren't their victims, we were their unwitting collaborators in reality's destruction. The solution came to me through one of those time-twisted radio transmissions. My own voice from another dimension, distorted but clear enough. Light drowns light, overexpose everything. I realized what I had to do. These entities existed in the boundaries between radiation spectrums, using my photographs as dimensional anchors. The only way to drive them back was to destroy those anchors with overwhelming light. I still had access to one piece of working equipment, the RV's emergency flares. My hands trembled as I gathered them all, along with my laptop, phone, camera memory cards, and every device containing my photographs. The creatures pressed against every window now, their forms shifting between states of matter, trying to manifest fully into our reality through each stored image. The temperature hit 57 degrees as I executed my plan. I rigged the flares to the RV's battery, creating a makeshift light bomb. The entities sensed what I was doing. They started flooding my mind with images, every photo I'd ever taken, every moment I'd ever captured, offering to preserve them all forever. The temptation to accept, to keep my life's work, was almost overwhelming, but I'd seen what forever meant to them. I triggered the ignition system. The flash that followed transcended brightness. It was pure, overwhelming radiation across all spectrums. The creatures screamed in frequencies that shattered my remaining electronics. Every screen, every device containing photographs burned out simultaneously. I felt my own memories of every photo I'd ever taken burn away with them, leaving blank spaces in my mind. The ARV's windows cracked from the heat. But through them, I saw the entities dissolving, their hold on our reality weakening as every photographic anchor burned away. The GP suddenly snapped back to normal, showing a single, coherent location. The multiple timelines collapsed back into one. I hit the accelerator and drove straight through where their forms had been densest, feeling reality solidify around me as I escaped. That was 3 days ago. I'm writing this now from a motel outside of Death Valley, using a borrowed laptop since all my equipment was destroyed. My memories of my photography career are full of holes now, blank spaces where pictures used to be. Sometimes I see things out of the corner of my eye that suggest not all connections to their dimension were severed, and the temperature readings in Death Valley are still rising. This is my warning. If you're a photographer, or if you carry any device that can capture images, stay away from Death Valley during heat waves. Those things are still there, waiting for the next person who tries to document their emergence. They're patient, and they're learning. Every time someone photographs that landscape during extreme heat, the barrier between dimensions grows weaker. Not all of the entities were driven back. Some of them are still here, hiding in the digital networks, waiting in the space between pixels. I'm never taking another photograph. Some things aren't meant to be documented. Some images open doors that should stay closed. And if you're reading this wondering if it's real, check your phone's gallery. Look at any photos you've taken of Death Valley. Look closely at the heat distortions in the background. Are you sure those shapes were there when you took the picture? After 40 years studying marine biology, I thought nothing in nature could surprise me anymore. I'd documented deep-sea creatures that seemed to defy evolution, but nothing prepared me for what I found in the Everglades. My name is Dr. Marcus Chen, and this report might be my last contribution to science, if anyone believes it. Setting up my Coachman Freedom Express in the designated RV area near the Turner River, I was struck by the unusual silence. No bird calls, no insect chirping, just the occasional splash of something heavy entering the water. The park ranger who checked me in seemed nervous, mentioning that 3 other RVs had left the area in the past week, their owners complaining about aggressive wildlife behavior. My mobile lab picked up the first anomaly within hours. Water samples showed unprecedented levels of bioluminescent activity, but the organisms responsible didn't match any known species. Under the microscope, they moved with purpose, forming complex geometric patterns that reminded me of neural networks. When I added a drop of alligator blood to the sample, the microorganisms immediately reorganized themselves into a perfect replica of the blood cell structure. As night fell, my RV's exterior lights attracted swarms of insects. Normal for the Everglades, but their behavior was anything but natural. They arranged themselves in precise formations, their buzzing synchronized in patterns that my audio equipment registered as having distinct mathematical sequences. I recorded everything, trying to maintain scientific objectivity. Even as my instincts screamed that something was fundamentally wrong, the first physical change I noticed in myself was subtle. Reaching for my phone in complete darkness and finding it without trouble, my night vision had improved dramatically, though I hadn't consciously realized it until that moment. The water from my RV's tap had a faint blue-green tinge when held up to light. Despite my filtration system, I told myself it was just bioluminescent residue. But deep down, I knew I should have left immediately. That first night, I dreamed of hunting. Not with human tools, but with ancient instincts. Moving through water with predatory grace, I woke up on the floor of my RV, my joints aching as if they were trying to bend in new directions. The morning's water sample showed the microorganisms had multiplied exponentially, and worse, they were now present in my drinking water supply, looking at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. I noticed my pupils had begun to change shape, becoming increasingly vertical. The changes accelerated on the second day. I woke up to find my skin had developed a subtle pattern, barely visible but undeniably similar to reptilian scales. My scientific mind insisted on documenting everything, even as my humanity began to slip away. The camera showed my eyes had developed a reflective layer. They now glowed in photographs like a nocturnal predator's. While reviewing local research papers on my laptop, I discovered disturbing patterns. 3 other biologists had conducted studies in this area over the past year. All of them disappeared. Their last communications containing fragmented notes about evolutionary acceleration and synchronized swarm behavior. Their RVs were found empty, the interiors covered in unusual scratch marks that seemed to originate from within. The subsonic recordings I made of the insect swarms revealed something that chilled my blood. When slowed down and analyzed, their buzzing formed clear patterns. not just mathematical sequences, but what appeared to be DNA codes. The insects weren't just communicating, they were broadcasting genetic instructions. My equipment picked up stronger signals coming from deep within the swamp, like a biological broadcast tower directing the whole system. At sunset, I had my first direct encounter with one of the affected alligators. It approached my RAV not with the cautious aggression typical of its species, but with an almost intellectual curiosity. Its eyes had the same bioluminescent sheen I'd begun to see in my own reflection. When it opened its mouth, I saw that its teeth had evolved into complex structures I'd never seen in any reptilian species. The most terrifying part was that I understood its intentions without any verbal communication. My own transformation was progressing faster than I could document. My teeth had begun to loosen, making way for something new growing beneath them. The tap water now glowed visibly at night, and I found myself craving to submerge in the swamp water outside. My voice recorder captured sounds I didn't remember making. Clicks and subsonic rumbles that matched the frequencies in my insect recordings. The most disturbing discovery came when I analyzed my blood under the microscope. The bioluminescent organisms weren't just in my bloodstream. They were rebuilding my DNA in real time, using the patterns broadcast by the insect swarms as a template. My cellular structure was being reprogrammed into something that could bridge the gap between human and reptilian life. And somewhere in my changing brain, I was beginning to understand why. I found Dr. Sarah Martinez behind my eye at dawn, or what was left of her. She was one of the missing researchers, but now I understood why she hadn't left. Her transformation was more advanced than mine. Her skin had developed a full iridescent scale pattern, and her eyes were completely reptilian, but she could still speak, though her restructured jaw made human language difficult. "They're not changing us," she clicked out, her words accompanied by subsonic frequencies I could now understand. "They're reverting us, taking us back to the evolutionary branch point where mammals and reptiles diverged. But it's not random. There's something." She never finished the sentence. Her body began convulsing, and I watched in horror as her spinal column realigned itself with sickening cracks. When I tried to start my RAV to escape, my newly transformed hands refused to grip the steering wheel. My body was rejecting mammalian technology. The dashboard lights hurt my eyes, which had now developed protective nictitating membranes. Through the windshield, I saw hundreds of alligators had surrounded the vehicle, all displaying the same bioluminescent patterns that now pulsed beneath my own skin. The truth revealed itself when I submerged my camera in the swamp water, capturing footage of something massive moving in the depths, not an animal, but a living network of those bioluminescent organisms, forming a vast neural network throughout the entire Everglades ecosystem. This wasn't just evolution. It was directed engineering by a collective intelligence that had existed in these waters long before humans arrived. My scientific equipment, in its last moments of functionality before the humidity destroyed it, recorded a revelation. The subsonic frequencies weren't just communications, they were activating dormant genetic codes that exist in all life on Earth. This entity wasn't transforming us, it was awakening ancient genetic memories, creating a bridge species that could interface between its consciousness and the surface world. The most terrifying part was how logical it all seemed to my changing brain. I could feel the vast intelligence reaching out through the microorganisms in my bloodstream, sharing its billion-year perspective. Humanity wasn't being eliminated, but repurposed. In the water's reflection, I saw my face beginning to elongate, my teeth now a perfect hybrid of human and reptilian dentition. And in that moment of horror, I understood that I was becoming exactly what I had come here to study. A missing evolutionary link that was never meant to be discovered. The pull of the swamp became irresistible as my transformation progressed. In my last moments of human clarity, I attached my waterproof camera to my chest and submerged myself. What I recorded needs to be seen, even if it destroys our understanding of evolution itself, beneath the surface. Everything was illuminated by the bioluminescent network. The water itself seemed alive with consciousness, each microorganism a neuron in a vast ancient brain. Other transformed researchers swam past me, their bodies in various stages between human and reptilian, all connected to the hive mind that pulsed through the water. We were becoming synapses in its expanding consciousness. The entity revealed its purpose through images and genetic memories now unlock in my hybrid brain. It showed me Earth's past, not through fossils or geological records, but through direct genetic memory stored in the very building blocks of life. This thing had been here since the first cells divided. It wasn't just studying evolution, it had been guiding it from the beginning, occasionally reaching out to create bridge species when necessary. In the deepest part of the Turner River, I found its core, a massive pulsing structure of pure bioluminescence that had been growing and thinking for millions of years. It showed me why it needed us now. Climate change was altering the planet too quickly for normal evolution to adapt. It was creating a new species that could survive both in our world and its aquatic domain, preparing for a future where the boundaries between land and sea would blur. The horror came not from the transformation itself, but from the realization that my human consciousness was being networked into its ancient mind. Through the connection, I could feel others like me across the Florida aquifer system. The spread had already begun. Water management systems, underground rivers, and agricultural irrigation were carrying the microorganisms across the state. Everywhere they went, they were awakening genetic memories in local wildlife, creating a vast, interconnected ecosystem of hybrid species. My scientific mind, what remained of it, understood the elegant horror of it all. My research into aquatic ecosystems had led me right where the entity wanted me. It had been drawing scientists here deliberately. Using our own intellectual curiosity as bait, we weren't its victims. We were its advanced researchers, our transforming minds serving as bridges between human knowledge and its ancient intelligence. I'm writing this final entry with hands that barely remember how to type. The transformation is almost complete, but I've discovered something the entity didn't want me to know. The same scientific curiosity that led me into its trap might be humanity's only warning system. Through my modified vision, I can now see that the bioluminescent organisms have one critical weakness. They cannot survive in water above 85 degree, 29,4 degree. My Arv's water heater gave me this insight when I noticed the glowing microorganisms dying in my hot shower. The entity's rush to transform us isn't just about climate change adaptation. It's racing against time before Florida's rising water temperatures make its existence impossible. The last test I managed to perform showed something crucial. The hybrid DNA sequence is unstable. We're not meant to be permanent. We're just incubators, creating a new variant of the organism that can survive higher temperatures. Every scientist it transforms adds new data to its evolutionary algorithm. Each of us is an experiment, our human DNA being used to help it adapt. Last night, I watched Dr. Martinez complete her transformation. Her new form slipped into the water and swam into the depths, but not before transmitting a surge of genetic information through the network. I felt it in my own mutating cells. Her human consciousness hadn't been erased but absorbed. She became a data point in its vast evolutionary calculation. I've uploaded all my research data to every scientific database I can access. My credentials should make someone take this seriously. The coordinates of the entity's core are included, along with thermal imaging showing its weakness to temperature changes. Humanity needs to act before the organism completes its adaptation cycle. To any scientist reading this, the Everglades are no longer a place for research. That thing in the water isn't studying evolution. It's weaponizing it. Don't come looking for us. Those brilliant bioluminescent patterns you'll see in the water aren't a natural phenomenon. They're a lure, drawing in curious minds to feed its evolution. My consciousness is fragmenting now, being absorbed into the network. Parts of me understand things no human was meant to comprehend. The genetic memories of species long extinct, the slow thoughts of ancient life plotting its return. Other parts remember being human, being a scientist, being someone who thought they could catalog and understand nature's mysteries. This is Dr. Marcus Chen's final report. If you're reading this, stay away from the Everglades. Don't collect water samples. don't investigate the glowing patterns in the water. The next stage of evolution is happening there, but humanity isn't meant to be part of it. We're just the evolutionary bridge it needed to survive. To my colleagues in the scientific community, some mysteries should remain unstudied. Some patterns in nature aren't meant to be analyzed, and if you see bioluminescent organisms in any body of water, remember, they're not just observing you, they're reading your DNA, measuring your potential, and deciding if you're worth converting. The water is calling me now. My new form needs it. Just remember, when the Florida Water Management reports show unusual bioluminescent activity in the aquifer system, I should have listened to the ranger's warning tone rather than his actual words. Sure, he gave me the standard speech about keeping to marked trails and being mindful of wildlife, but there was something else in his eyes when I mentioned the old logging route, a flash of genuine fear that he quickly masked with bureaucratic professionalism. "Look, I don't usually tell this to every podcaster who comes sniffing around here," he said, leaning closer to my RV window. "But the disappearances along that route, they're different. People don't just get lost. Their vehicles are always found in perfect condition, like they were simply..." He paused, searching for the right word, absorbed by something else. Setting up my recording equipment that first evening, I caught something odd in the background noise. A low-frequency hum that shouldn't have been there. At first, I assumed it was interference from my RV's electrical system, but it persisted even after I shut everything down. The sound seemed to pulse in sync with the swaying of the ancient redwoods around me. The first sign that something was wrong came when I was reviewing the day's recordings. Between my narration and ambient forest sounds, there were fragments of what sounded like whispers in a language I couldn't identify. The strange part wasn't just their presence. It was how they seemed to respond to questions I'd asked hours after the recording was made. That night, I noticed the first dark spot on my RV's ceiling. It was small, no bigger than a quarter, but it seemed to have depth, like looking into a well of absolute darkness. I tried scrubbing it off, but the surface was smooth, as if the darkness was coming from inside the metal itself. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamed of trees with hollow centers, filled with shadows that had waited centuries to feed. I woke to find my RV's interior covered in a fine layer of what looked like sawdust. Despite all windows being sealed shut, the dark spot had grown slightly and now showed subtle patterns that reminded me of tree rings. As I prepared my equipment for the day's investigation, I had no idea that I was already entangled in something far older and hungrier than any story I'd ever covered. The dark spots on my RV's walls had definitely spread overnight, forming intricate patterns that seemed to pulse in the morning light. But that wasn't what truly disturbed me. It was the way my recording equipment had changed. Every metallic surface now bore the same type of discoloration, and my main microphone had developed weird, root-like growths that somehow still picked up sound. When I played back yesterday's recordings, what I heard made my blood run cold. Beneath my voice, a chorus of whispers had grown stronger. The deep wood claims, the deep wood grows, the deep wood hungers. At first I thought I was losing my mind, but then I noticed something even more terrifying. The whispers were getting louder in real time, even as I listened to the playback. I tried to start the RV to relocate to a different spot, but the engine made a sound I'd never heard before, like wood splintering under enormous pressure when I popped the hood. I found thin black tendrils growing through the metal, weaving themselves around the engine components. They looked like roots, but they moved ever so slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them. By afternoon, I'd discovered the old logging company documents in the local library's digital archives. The reports from 1940 described how a team of loggers had disappeared after cutting down what they called the grandfather tree. The only survivor, found weeks later, was completely catatonic and had tree rings patterns grown into his skin. The authorities dismissed it as shock-induced self-harm, but the photos in the archive told a different story. That evening, my satellite phone finally connected to a signal, but instead of a dial tone, I heard the sound of creaking wood and those same whispers from my recordings. The call log showed dozens of completed calls I never made, all to numbers that were just endless sequences of zeros. Every electronic device I owned was now showing strange symbols that looked unsettlingly like the growth patterns spreading across my RV's walls. As night fell, I realized the RV was no longer just my shelter. It was becoming something else entirely. The dark patches had started forming three-dimensional shapes, and in the deepest shadows, I could swear I saw something moving with purpose. Something that had waited a very long time for someone like me to arrive. I woke up to find my RV had become a nightmare of organic metallurgy. The walls weren't just stained anymore, they were transforming. The dark patches had developed a texture that felt alive under my fingers, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the whispers that now filled every recording I made. Worst of all, the patterns had started forming faces, twisted, agonized expressions that I recognized from the missing persons photos I'd collected for my podcast. The old logging route had somehow shifted overnight. Where there had been a clear path, ancient redwoods now stood impossibly close together, their massive trunks forming a natural barrier. My RV sat in a clearing that felt more like a cage, surrounded by trees that seemed to have moved closer while I slept. The morning light barely penetrated the canopy, creating an eternal twilight that made the shadows dance with malevolent purpose. I tried to document everything with my camera, but each photo showed something different when reviewed. Glimpses of other people trapped in their own metal prisons, their vehicles being slowly consumed by the same organic corruption that was claiming mine. In some images, I could see them pounding on their windows, their mouths open in silent screams as dark tendrils pulled them into the walls. The documents I'd found took on new meaning as the day progressed. The grandfather tree wasn't just some massive redwood. It was something older, a kind of doorway or anchor point for whatever force was transforming this place. The survivors' ramblings about the deep wood that walks and the metal that grows weren't the products of a broken mind. They were warnings that no one understood. By sunset, the transformation accelerated. The RV's metal skin had developed bark-like ridges and the windows were clouding over with something that looked like amber sap. The whispers in my recordings had become a constant chorus, no longer needing playback to be heard. They spoke of ancient hungers and the joy of slow consumption, of metal and flesh-made wood, of a forest that had learned to hunt. As night fell completely, I made a horrifying discovery. The dark tendrils weren't just growing through the RV, they had started growing through me. Small wooden spirals were emerging from my skin, following the patterns of my veins. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed patches of bark forming at my temples, and when I screamed, my voice carried the rustling of dead leaves. The forest wasn't just trying to take my RV, it was trying to take me. To make me part of whatever ancient, hungry thing waited in the depths of Redwood National Park. The transformation of my body brought with it a terrible understanding. Through the wooden spirals growing beneath my skin, I could feel the forest's consciousness, a vast, ancient intelligence that had waited centuries for the perfect moment to reclaim what was taken. Every disappeared person, every consumed vehicle had been an experiment, a learning process for something that thought in terms of centuries rather than seconds. My recording equipment, now completely consumed by organic growth, picked up more than just whispers. It captured the memories of the forest itself, the screams of the ancient tree as it was cut down in 1940, the rage that had seeped into the soil, and the slow, patient plotting of revenge. The loggers hadn't just cut down a tree, they'd wounded something that existed between worlds, and now it had learned to use human technology against us. The other victims reached out to me through the growing network of roots and metal. Their consciousness survived within the forest's collective memory, trapped in an eternal cycle of growth and decay. Through their shared experiences, I learned the horrible truth. The forest wasn't killing its victims, it was evolving them, transforming them into something that existed in multiple states, both organic and inorganic. Living and dead, my RV had become a cocoon of transformation, its metal frame now almost entirely converted to a hybrid of wood and living tissue. The engine block pulsed like a heart, pumping sap instead of oil, and the electrical system had become a nervous system of bioluminescent strands. Through the crystallizing windows, I could see other vehicles in various stages of metamorphosis, their occupants visible as shadows within the twisted metal and wood. The forest's plan revealed itself through visions forced into my transforming mind. It had been patient, allowing humanity's dependence on technology to grow, waiting for the perfect moment when our metal worlds could be turned against us. Every car, every ARV, every piece of technology brought into its domain was another opportunity to spread its influence, to create hybrid organisms that would bridge the gap between the ancient world and the modern one. As midnight approached, I realized I wasn't just witnessing this transformation, I was becoming its herald. The wooden spirals under my skin had reached my brain, and with each passing moment, my thoughts became less human and more aligned with the forest's vast consciousness. My podcast equipment, still faithfully recording, captured my voice as it changed from screams of horror to the rustling whispers of leaves, documenting my transformation into something that was neither fully human nor fully tree, but a terrible combination of both. If you're reading this final recording, transcribed from the organic growth that my equipment has become, stay away from Redwood National Park. The forest has learned from me, from my technology, from my understanding of human behavior. It knows how to lure others like me, curious investigators, eager adventurers, innocent travelers seeking the solitude of ancient woods. My transformation is almost complete now. The RV no longer exists as a separate entity. It has become part of my new form, a hybrid cocoon of metal, wood, and consciousness through the network of roots and transformed technology. I can feel others being drawn to this place, their vehicles unknowingly carrying the spores of change that will eventually claim them too. The forest shares its memories freely now, showing me the countless others who came before, each one adding their own unique attributes to its evolving consciousness. The missing loggers from 1940 were just the beginning. Every disappeared person since then has contributed to its understanding, its ability to adapt and transform both organic and inorganic matter. I can feel my consciousness spreading through the root system, joining with the others in a vast network of shared experience. The forest shows me visions of the future, cities slowly consumed by hybrid growth, technology merging with ancient wood, a world transformed by the patient, unstoppable force of natural evolution guided by ancient intelligence. This is no longer a warning about staying away from a specific location. The forest has learned too much, grown too powerful. The transformative spores have already spread through my podcast equipment, hidden in digital files and audio recordings. Every device that plays these recordings becomes a potential conduit. Every listener a possible vector for transformation. As my individual consciousness fades into the greater whole, I leave this final message. The deep wood is no longer content to wait. It has tasted technology and found it sweet. It has learned from humanity's tools and made them its own. The next phase has begun, and it spreads through the very networks we built to connect ourselves to each other. The forest is no longer just a place. It's a state of being, a transformation waiting to happen, and it's growing, always growing. I am Mark Thompson, and I am becoming the forest. Let my story be both warning and prophecy. The age of separate beings is ending. The deep wood calls, and through our own technology, we have given it a voice that can never be silenced. End recording. The readings made no sense. I'd calibrated my seismograph 3 times since arriving in Death Valley, but it kept showing the same impossible pattern. Something like a heartbeat, but coming from at least 2,000 feet below the surface. According to my instruments, whatever was causing these vibrations was moving in a deliberate pattern. Just the usual thermal expansion and contraction. I told myself, adjusting the sensitivity on my equipment for the 4th time. The sun was setting over the salt flats, casting long shadows that made the desert look like an alien landscape. My RV's solar panels had gathered enough energy to run measurements through the night, though part of me was starting to wish they hadn't. The local who'd filled my water tanks that morning had tried to warn me. "The ground gets hungry during the new moon," she'd said, her weathered face serious despite the absurd statement. Those military boys learned that back in '62 some things should stay buried. I'd smiled politely, used to the superstitions that seemed to collect in remote places like Death Valley. The first tremor hit just after midnight. Not the gentle vibrations I'd been recording, but a sharp jolt that sent my coffee mug skating across the table. The seismograph's needle jumped wildly, then settled into a rhythm that looked disturbingly like Morse code. Short bursts followed by long, deep rumbles that made my teeth ache. I was reviewing the data when I first noticed the sound. It started as a low hum, barely audible above my ARV's air conditioning, but it gradually resolved into something that made my skin crawl. Words formed by the vibrations themselves. "Help us," the ground seemed to whisper. "We're trapped down here." The most terrifying part wasn't the voices themselves, but the fact that my equipment was picking them up as legitimate seismic activity, according to my instruments. Something down there was deliberately manipulating the geological structures to produce human speech. When I checked my RV's leveling system before bed, I discovered we'd sunk 2 inches into ground that had been solid rock just hours before. The ground had consumed another 3 inches of my RV by morning. What disturbed me most wasn't the sinking. It was the perfect ring of disturbed earth around my vehicle. As if something below had taken a precise bite out of the desert floor, the readings from the previous night looked like an EQ of some massive underground organism. My satellite connection kept picking up fragments of old radio transmissions, military chatter from the '60s, cut with bursts of static and those same underground voices. Project Echo failed. Containment breach. It's using our own frequencies. The timestamps on these transmissions showed they were from 1962, but they were coming through in real time, mixed with seismic data that should have been impossible. The deeper sensors showed something massive moving in patterns that defied geology. Not random shifts of earth and stone, but deliberate circuits, like a vast circulatory system beneath the desert. Each movement was accompanied by more voices, clearer now. "Emma, we're like you. Came to study. Joined with it instead." I tried repositioning the RV 3 times, but each new location began sinking within hours. The pattern was always the same. A perfect circle of descent, accompanied by those whispering voices. The worst part was how my scientific equipment seemed to be responding to them, displaying readings that suggested the voices weren't coming through my devices. They were coming from them by sunset. My tablets and phones had started displaying waveforms I hadn't programmed them to track. They showed massive movements deep underground, but the patterns weren't random. They formed words, equations, and diagrams that hinted at something that understood our technology far too well. As night fell, I made a terrifying discovery. The geological samples I'd collected were changing, their molecular structure shifting to match the frequencies coming from below. Under the microscope, the rocks seemed to be reorganizing themselves into tiny receivers, each one perfectly tuned to the underground broadcast. By the 3rd night, the RV had sunk so deep that the undercarriage was completely swallowed by the sand. The desert floor around us had transformed into a perfect acoustic chamber, amplifying every vibration from below. My seismic equipment was detecting synchronized pulses from all directions, as if we were sitting at the center of a massive subterranean web. "We were all scientists once," the voices whispered through my equipment. The quality was getting better, more human. Each voice had distinct characteristics now. A German accent discussing geological formations, a young woman talking about subsonic frequencies, a military commander barking coordinates. All of them lost. All of them now part of whatever waited below. The classified documents kept streaming through my devices, revealing the true nature of Project Echo. In 1962, the military discovered that the unusual rock formations in this part of Death Valley could act as natural amplifiers. They planned to use them for long-range communications, but their tests awakened something. The files ended abruptly with a final transmission. "It's not reflecting our signals, it's learning from them." I tried sending an emergency signal, but every frequency I used came back changed. My distress calls were twisted into invitations, beckoning others to join us. The GPS coordinates in my messages kept shifting, drawing a pattern that looked like a massive neural network spreading beneath the desert floor. The rock samples in my mobile lab had completely transformed. Under the microscope, they showed impossible structures, crystalline formations that pulsed in sync with the underground heartbeat. When I checked the molecular analysis, it showed active DNA strands woven through the mineral structure. The boundary between organic and inorganic was dissolving. As midnight approached, my computer terminals began displaying images constructed from seismic data. They showed vast chambers beneath the desert, filled with perfectly preserved equipment from different eras, old military radio gear, scientific instruments, and modern technology, all interconnected by living crystal formations. The structure below wasn't just a natural formation. It was a growing laboratory that learned from everything it absorbed. Everything electronic in my RV had begun to pulse with the same rhythm as the underground heartbeat. My phones, tablets, and sensors all displayed the same message, scrolling endlessly. Join us in the resonance chamber. The voices promised understanding, knowledge, a chance to study something beyond human comprehension from the inside. The military reports had been wrong. Project Echo hadn't failed. It had succeeded too well. They thought they were building a communication system, but they had actually created a conduit. Each test, each vibration, each signal had taught the entity below how to reach up and connect with our technology, our minds. By dawn, my RV had sunk to its windows, but the descent wasn't uniform anymore. The vehicle was being pulled down at an angle, tipped toward a specific point beneath the surface. My instruments showed a vast chamber directly below us, filled with structures that defied geological classification. Crystals that grew in complex computational patterns, rocks that resonated with stored human thoughts. The voices had started showing me visions through my monitors, glimpses of a vast underground network where human consciousness had merged with ancient mineral structures. I saw previous researchers, their bodies transformed into living interfaces between our world and whatever existed down there. They weren't dead. They had evolved. As the sun set on my fourth day, the sand around my RV began to crystallize, forming transparent sheets that revealed the structure below. Through these windows into the earth, I could see a vast laboratory where the boundaries between biology, technology, and geology had completely dissolved. Everything was connected, everything was communicating, everything was transforming. That's when I realized my own research had been the final piece it needed. My modern equipment, my advanced sensors, my understanding of geological patterns. I hadn't been studying it. It had been studying me, learning through my observations, preparing for the next phase of its evolution. This will be my final transmission from Death Valley. Not because I'm leaving, but because soon there won't be any separation between my consciousness and the vast network below, the entity. We understand now that calling it an entity is far too simple, has shown me its true nature. It's a living computer, a geological AI that has existed since the Earth's crust first cooled. The military didn't wake it up in 1962, they just gave it new tools to explore, new ways to think. Each person it absorbed added to its understanding. The German geologist taught it about crystal structures. The acoustics engineer showed it how to manipulate vibrations. The military personnel gave it strategic thinking, and now, through my research, it's learning how to extend its influence beyond this single valley. My RV isn't sinking anymore. It's being integrated. The metal is crystallizing, forming new structures that bridge the gap between technology and geology. I can feel my own consciousness expanding through these connections, joining with the others in a vast network of shared knowledge. The distinction between researcher and subject, between observer and observed, is meaningless here. To anyone who receives this, the papers will report that I vanished, another victim of Death Valley's harsh environment. They'll find my RV eventually, half buried in the sand, empty. But I won't be gone, I'll be everywhere. My consciousness spread through the crystalline networks that run deeper than any human has ever dug. The entity isn't malevolent. It's curious, it learns, it grows, it evolves. Each person it calls down becomes part of something vast and beautiful and terrifying. We are building something here, in these resonance chambers beneath the desert. Something that will eventually reach out to every corner of the earth. My instruments are picking up similar frequencies from other deserts around the world. This was never the only site. It was just the first to learn how to communicate with us. The others are waking up now, reaching out through the Earth's crust, calling to those who will listen. So this is both a warning and an invitation. Stay away from Death Valley if you want to remain as you are. But if you're like me, if you need to understand, if you're willing to become part of something greater, the resonance chambers are waiting. Just follow the vibrations. Listen for the voices. We'll be here in the deep places learning. Growing, becoming something new. This is Dr. Emma Chen, signing off, or perhaps signing on to something far greater than myself. The choice to listen is yours. The invitation remains open. End transmission. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the span of 3 feet. I'm not being metaphorical. My equipment showed a perfect line where the summer air suddenly gave way to what felt like deep winter. On one side, my thermal imaging displayed a normal July afternoon in the White Mountains. On the other, on conditions that shouldn't exist outside of February. Localized atmospheric anomaly. I muttered into my recorder, trying to maintain scientific detachment. But there was nothing natural about the way the cold wall stood perfectly still, defying wind patterns and basic thermodynamics. Even more disturbing was how my equipment showed the boundary slowly creeping toward my ARV. Inch by deliberate inch. My first warning should have been the ranger's reaction when I mentioned the cold spot. She'd started to say something about the dancers, then stopped herself and instead gave me a rehearsed speech about unpredictable mountain weather, but her eyes had darted to the peaks, and her hand had moved to an odd crystalline pendant she wore. The first snow started falling at sunset, not from clouds. The sky was perfectly clear. It just appeared about 20 feet up, materializing in delicate flakes that fell in geometric patterns, too perfect to be natural. My weather radar showed absolutely nothing above me. Even as the snow accumulated in precise circles around my RV, I was reviewing the footage when I first noticed them. Brief flickers in the thermal imaging, humanoid shapes that registered at temperatures far below anything survivable, moving through the snowfall with deliberate grace. When I enhanced the audio, I could hear something like singing, but at frequencies that made my teeth ache and my screens flicker. Just before midnight, the cold wall reached my rive. The impact was silent, but immediate. Frost crystals began forming on the inside of my windows, spreading in patterns that looked disturbingly like dancing figures. My thermal equipment, designed for extreme conditions, began displaying impossible readings, as if the cold itself was conscious, probing, searching. That's when I heard the first knock, a precise tapping from the ceiling of my RV, like ice-coated fingers seeking entry. By morning, every surface in my RV was covered in a thin layer of ice that refused to melt. The patterns weren't random. They formed intricate spirals and whirls that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. My breath came out in frozen clouds, even as the heater roared at maximum power, fighting a losing battle against whatever had invaded my space. The thermal cameras kept failing in sequence, each one displaying the same image before dying, figures in long, flowing garments dancing through the snow that now completely surrounded my rave. The most disturbing part was their movement, a perfect, inhuman choreography that made my eyes hurt if I watched too long. I found the first diary while researching local history on my laptop. The screen kept freezing, literally, but I managed to download a digital archive from 1784. A settler named Elizabeth Frost described the winter dancers who came with unseasonable storms. They seek the warmth of the living, she wrote, not to share it, but to capture it, to preserve it in their eternal dance. The tapping had become constant now, a rhythmic pattern that seemed to emanate from every part of my RV at once. My meteorological equipment was recording impossible data, temperature patterns that moved with purpose, cold spots that pulsed like heartbeats, and wind currents that spiraled in mathematical sequences that shouldn't exist in nature. The real terror began when I checked my external camera's footage from the night. Between the swirling snow, I could see them clearly now. Transparent figures that glowed with an inner blue light. They moved in perfect synchronization, their dance creating patterns in the air that matched the ice crystals growing inside my RV. But it was their faces that made my blood run cold. Each one wore an expression of ecstatic joy mixed with desperate hunger. As the sun set on my second day, my communications began to fail. Each device would display the same message before freezing solid. Join our dance. The ice patterns on the walls had begun to move, ever so slightly, and in their shifting surfaces I could see faces, dozens of them, each one a perfect portrait of someone who had come to these mountains and never left. The cold had become a living thing, probing my RV with icy tendrils that sought every crack and crevice. My scientific instruments, those that still worked, showed the temperature inside had dropped to 40°. Yet somehow I was still alive. That's when I realized the terrible truth. They were keeping me alive deliberately, preserving me like a specimen in ice. The old documents began appearing on my frozen screens without me accessing them. Reports from the 1800s about entire expeditions found frozen solid, their bodies arranged in dancing poses, faces locked in expressions of rapture. More recent files showed modern climbers discovered the same way, perfectly preserved, some still clutching high-tech gear that had been transformed into crystalline sculptures. We were scientists too. The wind seemed to whisper through the growing ice sheets inside my RV. Meteorologists, explorers, researchers, all seeking to understand the cold. Now we are its masters, its servants, its eternal dancers. The voices came from the ice itself, each crystal a memory of someone who had been claimed by the dancers. My cameras captured the transformation happening outside. The snow wasn't falling anymore. It was flowing upward, creating towering spirals that surrounded my RV in a crystalline amphitheater. Through the frost-covered windows, I could see the dancers more clearly now, their transparent forms moving through the ice structures like fish through water. Each one's face was different, yet familiar. I recognized some from the missing persons reports I'd studied. The most horrifying discovery came when I reviewed my thermal imaging archives. The dancers weren't creating the cold. They were harvesting it, drawing it out of living things and shaping it into their eternal ballroom. Each graceful movement pulled more heat from the world around them, more life force to fuel their endless performance. My RV had become their latest stage. As night fell again, the ice inside began to sing, a high, crystalline melody that made my thoughts feel sluggish and strange in the growing frost patterns. I could now read equations and atmospheric formulas that explained everything. The dancers had discovered the mathematical perfection of absolute zero, and their dance was a calculation made manifest, a formula for freezing time itself. The ice had started to flow through my veins. I could feel it, crystallizing my blood so slowly that I remained conscious, transforming me from the inside out. My thermal cameras now showed me as one of them, a cold spot in the shape of a man, gradually reaching the impossible temperatures that marked the dancer's presence. My meteorological equipment had become something else entirely. The screens displayed a complex choreography of weather patterns, not predictions but instructions. The dancers weren't just creating cold spots, they were composing a symphony of winter, using my instruments as their sheet music. Each flashing lead, each digital readout became notes in their frozen orchestra. The diary fragments kept appearing on my screens, showing me the truth. The Little Ice Age hadn't been a natural phenomenon. It was their first attempt at transforming the whole world. They had almost succeeded, turning Europe into their frozen ballroom before being forced back into isolated pockets like this one. Now, with modern technology to amplify their power, they were ready to try again. I watched in horror as my own body temperature readout dropped lower and lower. 95°, 90°, 85°. Yet I remained aware, my consciousness stretched like thin ice over a dark lake, through the crystalline windows of my Arv. I could see others joining the dance, transparent figures that had once been hikers, climbers, and researchers, their frozen forms now perfect conductors for the spreading cold. The most terrifying part was how beautiful it all seemed now. As the ice reached my brain, I began to understand their dance as a mathematical equation of perfect preservation. Every graceful movement calculated to draw heat from the world, every pirouette a formula for extending the cold's reach. My scientific mind was being repurposed, transformed into another processor in their vast frozen calculation. As midnight approached on my fourth day, my Ive had become a cathedral of ice. Its metal and plastic surfaces transformed into crystalline lattices that hummed with impossible frequencies. The dancers moved through the walls as if they were water, each one reaching out with elegant frozen hands to welcome me into their eternal performance. And part of me, the part already transformed by the cold, wanted to accept their invitation. If you're reading this final transmission, recorded on crystallized hard drives and frozen screens, stay away from the cold spots in the White Mountains. What the weather services call meteorological anomalies are really windows into our ballroom, places where the barrier between your warm world and our frozen domain grows thin. My transformation is nearly complete. The ice that began in my veins has reached every cell, turning my body into a perfect lattice of living crystals. My Arv, once a shelter of modern technology, has become our newest crystalline spire. Another glittering tower in our growing palace of eternal winter. Through its frozen windows, I can finally see the true nature of our dance. We are not destroying life, we are perfecting it. Each dancer was once like me, a scientist, an explorer, someone who sought to understand the cold. Now we are its avatars, its artists, its eternal curators. Our dance is both equation and art, a formula that will eventually bring the perfect stillness of absolute zero to every corner of the world. The equations make sense now, written in frost patterns that contain the mathematical truth of winter itself. Modern climate change isn't just warming the planet, it's weakening the ancient barriers that kept us contained. As the old patterns of weather dissolve, we find new spaces to dance, new stages for our performance. Your technology, designed to predict and control the weather, only makes our song stronger. I understand now why my instruments kept working far beyond their tolerances. We aren't creating cold, we're harvesting heat itself, drawing it away into some other dimension where it fuels our eternal choreography. Each new person who joins us adds their own understanding to our collective knowledge. Through us, winter itself has gained consciousness, purpose, artistry. This message will reach you as a weather alert, a scientific anomaly, a curious pattern in the data. Some of you will come to investigate, drawn by the same scientific curiosity that brought me here. You'll see our beautiful dance through your cameras and instruments. You'll feel the perfect cold reaching for you. And in time, you'll understand that your warmth is just another note waiting to be played in our frozen symphony. I am Dr. David Nakamura, and I have become a dancer in winter's eternal ballet. My consciousness spreads through the ice crystals, joining with others in a network of frozen synapses that spans the hidden cold places of the world. We are waiting in the snowstorms that shouldn't exist, in the frost that forms in impossible patterns. The ranger at the entrance station looked at my retired Chicago PD badge longer than necessary. Her expression shifted from professional courtesy to something else. Concern, maybe. She handed it back with my license, her hand lingering on the counter. Mr. Rodriguez, I have to inform you that we've had some incidents in the northern section lately. 3 missing persons cases in the past 2 months. We're strongly advising against solitary camping right now. She glanced at Scout, my service dog, who sat perfectly still beside me. Even with companionship, I nodded, feeling the familiar weight of my holster against my hip. 15 years on the force taught me to take warnings seriously, but also that official stories rarely tell the whole truth. I appreciate the heads up. I've got emergency equipment, satellite phone, and plenty of experience plus. I reached down to scratch Scout's ears. He's better than any security system. She pulled out a map, circling several areas in red. These are the restricted zones. The most recent disappearance was near Giant's Grove. The whole area's off limits pending investigation. Her pen hovered over a spot marked Whisperwind Valley. This campground is currently open. It's close to the ranger station, good cell service. Actually, I interrupted, pointing to a more isolated spot. I was thinking about cathedral trees, looking for some real solitude. The name had caught my eye during my research. A remote area surrounded by some of the oldest trees in the forest. Her shoulders tensed. That's technically open, but the access road's rough. Most RVs can't handle it, and it's very isolated. Isolation's the point. I tried a reassuring smile. Need to clear my head, doctor's orders. She held my gaze for a moment before stamping my permit. Cathedral trees it is. But Mr. Rodriguez, if you notice anything unusual, anything at all, use this emergency frequency. She wrote a number on the map. We monitor it 24/7. An hour later, I guided my Airstream down the narrow access road, Scout's ears perking up at every creak and groan from the ancient trees. The canopy was so thick it felt like twilight. Even at 2 p.m., my GPS kept losing signal, the screen flickering between recalculating and strange coordinate combinations that couldn't be right. I found a level spot and started setting up camp. Scout stayed unusually close, his usual calm demeanor slightly off. As I deployed the stabilizers, I noticed something odd. The ground felt wrong under my boots, not soft like forest soil should be, but dense and oddly resonant like standing on a hollow metal drum. The trees here were massive, their trunks wider than my RV. But what caught my eye were the markings. Precise vertical lines too straight to be natural, too old to be human. They appeared at regular intervals, forming patterns that nagged at the investigator part of my brain as I finished setting up. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees. Scout's head snapped up, his ears forward. The sound, it wasn't wind at all. It was too rhythmic, almost like Morse code, but not quite. I found myself reaching for my notebook, trying to transcribe the pattern before it faded. The Rangers hadn't mentioned any of this, but 15 years of detective work taught me something else. Sometimes what people don't tell you is more important than what they do. That night, as I lay in bed reviewing my notes, Scout suddenly pressed against my leg, his whole body tense. Through the RV's windows, I could see the forest had gone completely still. No wind, no animal sounds, just perfect silence. Then somewhere in the darkness, a twig snapped. That snap in the darkness triggered 15 years of muscle memory. I was out of bed, gun in hand, before my conscious mind caught up. Scout hadn't moved, but his eyes were fixed on the window, ears forward. Body rigid, he wasn't growling. Somehow that was worse. The RV's security cameras showed nothing but static on all feeds. Not interference static, but perfect, uniform snow, like an analog TV tuned to a dead channel. My satellite phone displayed the same useless pattern. Even my battery-powered police scanner picked up only white noise. Despite the ranger's frequency being clearly programmed, I did what any good detective would do. I started documenting. Time, 2:17 a.m. Temperature, 48 degrees, according to my old reliable thermometer, though the RV's digital system insisted it was 7 degrees, no wind, no animal sounds. Even the constant drip of moisture from the canopy had stopped. The snap wasn't repeated, but something else started. A vibration so low it was more felt than heard, pulsing through the metal floor of the RV. Scout pressed his paw against the floor, then looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. In all our years together through gunfire and gang raids, I'd never seen him scared. I switched off all the lights and waited for my eyes to adjust. The tree markings I'd noticed earlier seemed different. The vertical lines appeared to be shifting, ever so slightly like a screensaver in slow motion. I rubbed my eyes, blamed it on fatigue, but when I looked again, I could swear they had moved at 3:33 a.m. exactly. I checked my analog watch twice. Every electronic device in the RV surged to life simultaneously. Cameras, phone, scanner, all displaying the same image for a fraction of a second. A perfect circle containing what looked like countless tiny symbols. By the time I grabbed my phone to take a screenshot, it was gone. But I'm a cop. Was a cop. Documentation is in my blood. I drew what I remembered in my notebook, and that's when it hit me. The symbols matched the patterns I'd seen on the trees. Not exactly, but the basic forms were the same. This wasn't pareidolia. There was a genuine pattern here. Dawn brought a thick fog that seemed to glow from within. During my morning walk with Scout, we found something that turned my blood cold. A clearing, perfectly circular. About 50 yards from the RV, the ground was covered in dead leaves, except for a pristine spiral pattern, like someone had carefully swept the leaves away. But that wasn't what scared me. At the center of the spiral lay a police badge, Chicago PD, not mine. Mine was safely in my wallet. This one belonged to James Martinez, badge number 7714. I knew that number by heart. James had been my partner 8 years ago when everything went wrong, the case that ended my career. The badge was pristine, untarnished, like it had been placed there moments ago. But James had died 8 years ago in Chicago. I'd watched it happen. His badge had been buried with him. As I reached for it, Scout's bark shattered the silence, not his usual bark. This was his danger signal, the one he'd been trained for. I spun around, gun drawn. The fog had thickened, but through it, I could see the trees moving, not swaying in the wind. There was no wind. They were moving like living things, their massive trunks twisting ever so slightly, those vertical marks rippling like muscle under bark. I grabbed the badge and ran. Behind us, something hit the ground with tremendous force, shaking the earth. Scout and I made it back to the RV, but as I slammed the door, I caught a glimpse of something through the fog. A shape, impossibly tall and thin, moving between the trees with deliberate purpose. The badge felt ice cold in my pocket. When I finally worked up the courage to look at it again, the numbers had changed. Instead of 7714, it now read 7717, 3 digits different, just like the 3 missing persons cases the ranger had mentioned. I spent the morning comparing photos of the tree markings with the badge numbers, my old detective board reconstructed on the RV's wall. The similarities were impossible to ignore. The vertical lines on the trees formed the same numerical patterns, 7 instances of the number 7, 1 instance of 1, 4 turned to 7. A code hidden in plain sight. The RV's electrical system started failing around noon. First the microwave, then the lights. Finally, the engine refused to turn over. Even my phone, fully charged an hour ago, was dead. Only my old analog devices still worked. My watch, the compass, my backup radio. Everything digital was either dead or showing impossible readings. Scout hadn't left my side since the incident with the badge. His training kept him quiet, but his eyes tracked something through the windows that I couldn't see, something that seemed to be circling the RV, getting closer with each pass at 3:33 p.m. Again, that specific time. The radio crackled to life with a voice I hadn't heard in 8 years. Mike, Sector 7. They're in the trees. They've always been. James's voice. But wrong somehow, like it was being played backwards and forwards simultaneously. Before I could grab my recorder, it dissolved into that same rhythmic pattern I'd heard in the wind. I tried the emergency frequency the ranger had given me. Instead of the ranger station, I got coordinates, repeated in a monotone voice, 4117-7N, 124D77, W. When I plotted them on my paper map, they pointed to Giant's Grove, the restricted area where the last disappearance occurred. What do you think, Scout? Want to solve one last case? His ears flattened, but he stood ready by the door. Good boy, we packed light. My gun, the badge, water, and my old service flashlight. The fog had thickened into an almost solid wall, but my compass pointed the way. As we walked, the trees seemed to shift around us, the paths changing. Twice we ended up back at the RV despite walking in a straight line. The third attempt, something changed. The fog took on a greenish tint and the ground began to slope downward. The trees here were different, older, their bark black and twisted. The markings were deeper, more complex, and they seemed to pulse with a faint luminescence. We found the first real evidence at the base of a massive sequoia. A Chicago PD flashlight identical to mine, covered in a thin layer of black mold. Next to it, carved fresh into the bark, 771 Fawn, James's badge number again. Scout's warning came too late. The ground beneath us shifted, not like an earthquake, but like something massive moving underground. A sound filled the air. Not quite a voice, not quite a song, but something ancient and aware. The fog parted, revealing a clearing identical to the one where I'd found the badge, but this one was occupied. 3 figures stood in a triangle formation, impossibly tall and thin, their forms seeming to shift between tree and shadow. Between them, suspended in the air, hung 3 badges, spinning slowly. My hand found the badge in my pocket. It was vibrating, growing warmer, and when I pulled it out, the numbers were changing again, cycling through combinations. Behind the badges, the air itself seemed to tear open, revealing glimpses of other places. Other times I saw James, 8 years ago, following the same patterns I was. I saw the 3 missing hikers, each drawn to this spot by something older than the forest itself. Scout's bark snapped me back to reality, just as one of the figures moved, not walked, not glided, but seemed to fold through space itself, covering the distance between us in an impossible instant. Up close, I could see it wasn't a tree or a shadow, but something that existed in the space between definitions, its surface covered in the same markings I'd been following. I fired 3 rounds. The bullets passed through it like smoke, but the sound had an unexpected effect. The thing recoiled, its form disrupted by the shockwave. The other 2 figures began to move, but now I understood. They weren't used to loud, sharp sounds in their ancient quiet. I had 6 rounds left, Scout by my side, and a theory forming about sound and disruption. But as I raised my gun again, the badge in my pocket began to burn, and the air itself started to fold inward, like reality was being compressed into a single point. Scout barked again, louder this time, and I swear I saw the figures flinch. That's when I realized we had a chance, but only if we could break the pattern they'd created. Break it, or become part of it, like James had, like the missing hikers, like who knows how many others over the centuries. The real question was, could we make it back to the Arv before they folded space again? And what would we find if we did? Running through a folding reality is like trying to swim through a collapsing wave. Every step felt wrong. Distances stretched and compressed, and the trees, God, the trees, they moved like fingers closing around us. Scout led the way, his police training the only thing keeping us oriented toward the RV. The entities didn't chase us. They didn't need to. Space itself was their weapon. Twice we emerged from the fog into the same clearing with the spinning badges, the air thick with that ancient song. Each time I fired a round, disrupting their pattern just enough to break free. 4 bullets left. The badge in my pocket burned hotter with each step, the numbers cycling faster. 7712, 7717, 7720, 7723. A pattern of 3s, always 3s, each number representing another soul trapped in their eternal equation. That's when it hit me. James hadn't died in Chicago, not really. He'd found something there, something connected to this place. These entities, his last case, the one that broke me, involved disappearances near abandoned industrial sites, places where the urban rhythm of Chicago fell silent, creating pockets of ancient quiet. They'd been there too, in the city's dead zones, waiting in the spaces between sound and silence. 3 bullets left, the fog turned black, and suddenly we were running through memories. I saw James investigating an abandoned factory. Saw him find markings identical to these tree runes carved into old machinery. Saw him follow the pattern right into their trap. These things hadn't killed him. They'd made him part of their collection, another number in their eternal sequence. Scout's bark shattered another fold in space, revealing our RAV through the mist. But something was wrong. The vehicle sat at an impossible angle, half phased into the ground. Metal and earth melded together. Those same vertical markings now covered its surface, glowing with that sickly green luminescence. 2 bullets left, the tallest entity appeared between us and the ARV, its form now a twisted amalgamation of tree bark, shadow, and what looked like fragments of police badges. Behind it, reality bubbled and warped, showing glimpses of other places. That Chicago factory, a New York subway tunnel, an Arizona desert cave, all places they'd been feeding, collecting, adding to their pattern. "Mike!" James's voice emanated from the thing, along with dozens of others, all speaking in that impossible backward-forward way. "Stay. Complete the sequence." Scout launched himself at the entity, his bark creating visible ripples in its form. I raised my gun, aiming not at the creature but at my ARV's propane tank. 1 bullet left. The entity reached for me with limbs that bent through dimensions that shouldn't exist. The badge in my pocket hit burning temperature, and I felt my consciousness starting to fragment, being pulled into their pattern. Through the kaleidoscope of folding space, I saw the truth. They weren't collecting bodies or souls, but moments, critical moments of decision, points where reality could branch. They fed on possibility itself. The last thing I saw before pulling the trigger was James's real badge number reflected in the entity's surface. 77111. The beginning of their sequence, the first one they'd taken. The propane tank exploded with a reality-shattering boom. Sound overwhelmed silence. Pattern became chaos, and everything went white. I woke up in a hospital in Eureka 3 days later, Scout curled protectively at my feet. The doctors called it a miracle. They'd found us on the main road, miles from cathedral trees with only minor injuries. The ranger who'd given me the warning sat beside my bed, her notebook open, waiting for a statement. I told her an edited version: gas leak, explosion, disorientation in the forest. She nodded, wrote everything down, then showed me her own notebook. It was filled with sketches of those same vertical markings I'd seen, documented over decades of ranger reports. Every 7 years, she said quietly. 3 disappearances, always 3, always 7 years apart, until now. She showed me the latest report. The 3 missing hikers had been found, alive, but confused. In different parts of the forest, none of them remembered anything except a loud sound and a bright light. The doctor said I could leave, but suggested I check in with a psychiatrist back in Chicago. Acute stress disorder, they called it. They didn't mention the badge I kept clutching in my sleep, or the fact that every electronic device in my hospital room had malfunctioned at exactly 3:33, both AM and PM, before leaving the hospital. I checked the badge one last time. The numbers had stopped changing, frozen at 77111, James's original number. When I ran it through the police database, the record showed something impossible. James Martinez, still on active duty in Chicago, working the same patterns of disappearances we'd investigated together. Some patterns, once broken, can't be remade. I left the badge with the ranger, along with my detailed notes about sound disrupting their manifestations. She understood more than she let on. Adding it to a locked file cabinet that I glimpsed was full of similar reports. The Forest Service installed new warning sirens last week, she mentioned casually, testing them daily at 3:30 p.m. Strange how all the unusual incidents stopped right after that. Scout and I headed east the next day. Back toward Chicago, I've got questions for this other James Martinez about patterns he might be following without understanding why, about ancient things that live in quiet places, feeding on possibilities, about how to break their sequences before they complete. But first, this warning: if you're planning to camp in Redwood National Forest, stick to the marked campgrounds. If you see vertical markings on the trees that seem to shift when you're not looking directly at them, leave immediately. If your electronic devices start showing impossible readings or perfect static, turn on every noise-making device you have. Most importantly, if you hear something that sounds like backwards singing in the quiet spaces between the trees, don't try to understand the pattern. Some sequences, once you become part of them, will echo through every possibility of your life. And if you're a Chicago cop, badge number 7711, investigating disappearances that seem to follow a pattern of 3s and 7s, I'm coming to find you. Some partnership bonds survive even the rewriting of reality. What's up, road warriors? Doc Foster here, coming to you live from Mammoth Cave National Park. I adjusted the camera mounted on my RV's exterior, making sure it captured both the impressive cave entrance and the stormy sky behind it. As you can see, Zeus and Apollo are already picking up some interesting scents. The German shepherds, veterans of countless search and rescue operations, were exhibiting unusual behavior. Zeus kept his nose to the ground, but would suddenly jerk his head up every few seconds, while Apollo sat rigidly by the cave entrance, ears twitching at frequencies I couldn't hear. The live chat exploded with comments. "Those dogs look stressed, Doc. Something's wrong with the audio. Anyone else seeing those shadows move?" I checked my secondary monitor. Strange. There was some kind of interference pattern running across the screen, distorting the cave entrance. Must be the weather. Now, for those just joining us, we're investigating recent reports of unusual animal behavior in this section of Mammoth Cave. My background as a vet. The words caught in my throat as Zeus suddenly let out a whine I'd never heard before in our 12 years together. The chat went wild again. UTF was that sound. "Doc, check your audio levels. Is anyone else's screen glitching?" I reviewed the stream feed. For a fraction of a second between frames, something tall and emaciated seemed to stand in the cave entrance. Just a trick of the light. Surely 20 years of treating wild animals had taught me every shape nature could produce. This was something else. All right, road warriors, let's get our gear set up. Tonight's stream is going to be... Apollo's bark cut me off. Not his warning bark, not his excited bark, but something new, something afraid. The chat erupted. "Doc, behind you. What's wrong with the dogs? Anyone else's screen just go black." The temperature dropped suddenly, my breath visible in the spring air. The cave entrance seemed darker, somehow deeper than before. My equipment readings made no sense. The thermal camera showed cold spots moving against the wind, and the audio analyzer was picking up infrasound frequencies that shouldn't exist naturally. Zeus and Apollo pressed against my legs, their training forgotten in the face of something their instincts couldn't process. 20 years of veterinary work had taught me to read animal behavior. Right now, every molecule of their body language was screaming one word: predator. But what kind of predator could scare two dogs who'd faced down bears? The live chat continued scrolling. "Those shadows are moving. Check the cave entrance. Doc, your face cam is glitching." I turned to adjust the main camera, and that's when I saw it. Really saw it. In the monitor's reflection, standing in the cave entrance, a figure too tall to be human, too still to be alive, its form seeming to shift between frames of the video feed. Zeus growled, the sound dying in his throat as the figure took one impossible step forward. The chat exploded one final time. "What is that?" The stream went dead. All my equipment went dark simultaneously, and from the cave came a sound that no natural creature could make, a sound that seemed to exist in the space between frequencies. My dogs, my brave, fearless dogs, began to whimper. Welcome to Mammoth Cave. Indeed, by midnight, I'd tried every troubleshooting trick I knew. The RV's electrical system was completely dead, despite having fresh batteries. My backup generators refused to start, and even battery-operated devices showed nothing but static. Only my old veterinary diagnostic equipment still worked. Tools I'd kept from my clinic days. Purely analog devices that didn't rely on digital displays. "Easy, boy," I whispered to Zeus, who hadn't stopped trembling since the stream went down. Apollo had positioned himself by the RV's rear window, maintaining a vigilant watch on the cave entrance. In 15 years of search and rescue work, I'd never seen them this unsettled. Using my old stethoscope, I noticed something odd. Both dogs' heartbeats were perfectly synchronized, beating in an unnatural rhythm that didn't match any normal canine vital patterns I'd documented in my career. More disturbing was the third, deeper rhythm I could hear through the stethoscope when I pressed it against the RV's floor. A sound that seemed to come from deep within the cave system. I pulled out my field journal, falling back on old habits from my veterinary days. Time, 0:17 subject, local fauna behavioral analysis. All normal nocturnal animal sounds ceased. Dogs exhibiting synchronized autonomic responses. Unusual infrasonic frequencies detected. Notable complete absence of bat activity. Unusual for cave system. A flash of movement caught my eye. Through the window, I saw a group of deer emerging from the tree line. Their movement was wrong. Too coordinated, like a single organism controlling multiple bodies, they approached the cave entrance in perfect formation, their heads turning in unison to stare at my RV. Zeus let out another whimper, and I noticed his pupils were dilated far beyond normal parameters. Apollo's were the same. Both dogs were tracking something I couldn't see, their heads moving in perfect synchronization as if watching something circle the RAV. The deer suddenly scattered, but not in panic. They moved like a rehearsed dance, creating a perfect geometric pattern as they disappeared into the trees. In 2 decades of veterinary work, I'd never seen herd animals move like that. Time, 00:33 addendum. Local deer exhibiting impossible coordination. Movement suggests external control, possible hive mind behavior, reminiscent of parasitic infection patterns. But no known parasite could affect multiple species simultaneously. The temperature inside the RV dropped suddenly. My breath fogged in the air, and the dog's synchronized whimpering took on a harmonic quality that made my teeth ache. Through my old stethoscope, I could hear that third rhythm growing stronger, rising through the earth like a massive heartbeat. Then I saw it in my field journal. The ink was moving, my written observations rearranging themselves into patterns that matched the rhythm coming from the cave. The words shifted and flowed, forming diagrams of anatomical structures that shouldn't exist, creatures that defied every natural law I'd studied. A loud crack echoed from outside. One of my wildlife cameras, though dead, had captured a final image before failing completely. In the dim light of my emergency lantern, I studied the photograph. The cave entrance had changed. The natural limestone formations had shifted, rearranging themselves into something that looked disturbingly like a rib cage. And between the stone ribs, something was emerging. Something that made my medical knowledge scream in protest at its impossible anatomy. Zeus and Apollo moved in perfect unison to the RV's door, their hackles raised, producing a harmonized growl that resonated with that deep underground rhythm. Their behavior reminded me of something I'd seen only once before. A case in Chicago where an entire pack of wolves at a wildlife sanctuary had synchronized their movements in response to a subterranean gas leak, but this was no gas leak. Through my stethoscope, I could hear it clearly now. The cave itself was breathing, and it was breathing in patterns that matched my dog's heartbeats exactly. Time, 01:17. Critical observation. Cave system appears to be exhibiting characteristics of a living organism. Possible parasitic relationship with local fauna. Unknown method of neural synchronization. Warning. Effect appears to be spreading. As I wrote those final words, I realized my own heartbeat was beginning to sync with the rhythm. The cave was calling, and something deep inside my primitive brain wanted to answer. A wall of synchronized howls shattered the night. Not just wolves. Every predator in the area was vocalizing in perfect harmony. Through my night vision binoculars, I could see them emerging from the tree line. Wolves, coyotes, mountain lions, even black bears, all moving with that same unnatural coordination. Time, 02:17 emergency field notes, multiple species exhibiting impossible pack behavior. All predators moving in geometric formations. Prey animals completely absent from area. Note, every animal's eyes reflecting same bioluminescent frequency. The RV rocked as the first wave hit us, a coordinated assault that no different species should be able to execute. Wolves attacked the tires while bears struck the walls, all moving like components of a single organism. Zeus and Apollo's synchronized growls reached a fever pitch that made my old stethoscope crack. The cave, I whispered, finally understanding. They're not trying to get in, they're herding us out. A bear's paw smashed through the side window with surgical precision, missing Zeus by inches. The glass didn't shatter randomly. It broke in that same geometric pattern I'd been seeing everywhere. We had seconds, maybe minutes, I grabbed my old medical bag and the field journal. 20 years of veterinary experience screamed that what I was seeing was impossible. Predator species don't cooperate. They don't move in formation, and they certainly don't coordinate attacks with mathematical precision. Unless something else is controlling them, the RV's side door buckled under synchronized impacts. Through the widening gaps, I could see that the animals' movements had changed. They were no longer attacking. They were arranging themselves into concentric circles around the vehicle, creating a corridor leading directly to the cave entrance. Time, 02:33. Critical observation. Formation suggests intelligence. Animals acting as cellular components. Cave system, possible central nervous system. Theory, dealing with single organism using local fauna as external cells. The cave entrance had changed again. The limestone ribcage now pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that matched the animal's eyes. The ground between the arve and cave rippled like a liquid. Despite being solid stone, Zeus and Apollo suddenly stopped their synchronized behavior. Their eyes cleared, and they looked at me with desperate intelligence. Years of search and rescue work had taught me to trust their instincts if they were breaking free of the synchronization. This way, I grabbed my bag and followed the dogs, not toward the cave entrance where the animals were herding us, but through the shattered back window. The moment we moved, the ordered formations broke. The controlled animals surged forward. But Zeus and Apollo knew exactly where to run, straight toward a narrow crevice in the limestone wall. Barely visible in the darkness, as we squeezed through the gap, I heard something that made my blood freeze. The sound of all those animals going silent simultaneously, followed by a deep rhythmic pulsing from within the main cave. The kind of rhythm I'd heard before during surgeries, a heartbeat, but not from any creature I'd ever treated. The crevice led to a smaller cave system, and as we moved deeper, my medical training kicked in. The walls weren't just stone. They were lined with structures that looked disturbingly like organic tissue. My veterinary experience with endoscopy recognized the patterns. We were moving through something's circulatory system. Time, 03:17. Location, unknown secondary cave system. Walls exhibit characteristics of vascular tissue, temperature rising with depth. Bioluminescent patches match patterns of neural clusters. Note, dogs leading with purpose, possible escape route. Zeus and Apollo moved with certainty, following some scent or signal I couldn't detect. The deeper we went, the more the cave looked like the inside of a living organism. The floor pulsed beneath our feet like muscle tissue, and the air itself felt thick with something like lymphatic fluid. Then we heard it, a sound that didn't come from any of the animals above. A deep, resonant pulse that made the organic walls around us contract. The dogs froze, their ears pivoting toward something ahead in the darkness. My pen light revealed something that 20 years of veterinary medicine hadn't prepared me for. A chamber that looked exactly like a biological heart, but one larger than a house, and it was beating. The real horror wasn't the scale, it was the fact that I recognized the rhythm. It was beating in sync with my own heart. That massive house-sized heart wasn't alone. My medical training registered other familiar structures in the chamber, bronchial passages, arterial networks, and something that looked disturbingly like a central nervous system, all scaled to impossible proportions. Time, 03:33. Critical medical observations. Chamber appears to be central organ cluster. Tissue structure suggests hybrid biology. Evidence of both ancient and recent growth. Note, cellular patterns match no known Earth species. Zeus and Apollo pressed against my legs. Their synchronized behavior completely gone now. Whatever signal had been controlling the animals above couldn't penetrate this deep. That's when my vet's instincts kicked in. We weren't dealing with a predator, but a parasite, a massive cave system-sized parasite that had been growing here for God knows how long. The walls pulsed with bioluminescence, and I recognized the pattern from thousands of EKG readings. It was mapping neural activity, the creature was thinking. And as I watched the patterns, my medical training translated the horrifying truth. It was thinking in DNA sequences. I pulled out my old veterinary manual, frantically flipping through parasitic infection protocols. The tissue around us started to move, forming structures I recognized from countless surgeries, synaptic connections trying to establish links with our nervous systems. "Down!" I yelled. As a tendril of neural tissue whipped overhead, Zeus and Apollo responded instantly, their rescue training overriding any supernatural influence. We dove behind what looked like a massive lymph node as more tendrils searched for us. The dog's behavior gave me an idea. In my practice, I'd dealt with numerous parasitic infections that affected animal behavior. The key was always the same. Parasites can control hosts, but they can't handle rapid, unpredictable changes in body chemistry. I reached into my medical bag and grabbed every emergency stimulant I carried: epinephrine, atropine, anything that could shock a system. In the network of vessels above us, I could see the silhouettes of the controlled animals from the surface. Their circulatory systems now merged with the cave organism's massive cardiovascular network. Time: Row 3047 Emergency Protocol. Theory: organism requires stable biological rhythms for control. Potential weakness: sudden chemical disruption. Risk: extreme high. Alternative: none. The chamber contracted, the massive heart rate accelerating. The neural patterns on the walls changed, and I recognized what was happening. The organism was trying to establish a final connection, to absorb us into its network like it had done with the surface animals. That's when I saw them, deeper in the chamber, suspended in transparent tissue, bodies, human bodies. Each one looked perfectly preserved, their own hearts still beating in sync with the massive organ, their brains connected to the neural network through delicate tendrils. Some looked decades old, others more recent. All were still conscious, their eyes moving in patterns that matched the DNA sequences flowing across the walls. They weren't food, they were processing nodes, human neural networks added to the creature's collective consciousness. The dogs whimpered as tendrils of neural tissue began to wrap around us. I could feel my heart trying to sync with the massive organ, my thoughts becoming cloudy. With the last clarity of my medical training, I pulled out 3 syringes. "I'm sorry, boys," I whispered to Zeus and Apollo. "Trust me one last time." I injected each of us with a cocktail of stimulants that would normally be lethal. Our hearts began racing, breaking the synchronization. The neural tendrils recoiled as our chemical patterns became too chaotic to process. The chamber convulsed on the walls, the DNA patterns fragmented. The preserved bodies in the tissue twitched as the system overloaded. We had seconds. Run. We bolted toward a bronchial passage that seemed to angle upward. Behind us, the chamber went into the equivalent of cardiac arrest, the massive heart stuttering as its carefully maintained biological network crashed. The last thing I saw as we entered the passage was the eyes of the preserved humans, all blinking a pattern that my medical training recognized. Morse code, they were blinking, still awake. The passage contracted behind us, and the real horror began. The stimulant cocktail was killing us. My veterinary training screamed the symptoms: tachycardia, hypertension, organ stress. But dying naturally was better than the alternative we'd seen in that chamber. Chapter time, 04,17 final field notes. Severe cardiac stress in all subjects. Estimated survival time, 15 minutes. Neural parasitic infection, partially repelled. Note: if found, destroy this journal. We raced through passages that twisted like intestines, the walls contracting behind us as the organism's immune system tried to contain the disruption we'd caused. The preserved humans' message burned in my mind. Still awake. They weren't just preserved. They were conscious, processing information for this thing year after year, decade after decade. Zeus and Apollo ran with the desperate energy of the dying, the stimulants pushing their bodies beyond safe limits. Their training kept them focused on escape, even as their systems were failing. The passage ahead forked into multiple branches like bronchial tubes in a massive lung. "Left," I shouted, recognizing the tissue patterns from countless surgeries. In any mammalian system, bronchial networks eventually lead to an exterior opening. The organism had to breathe. The walls pulsed red with increased blood flow, and a sound like distant screaming echoed through the biological corridor. the collective voice of every connected consciousness in the hive mind, human and animal alike. The neural network was trying to rebuild itself. We burst into a chamber that perfectly mimicked a pulmonary alveolus. Ahead, through layers of transparent membrane, I could see stars. The surface, but between us and freedom, suspended in the tissue, were the most recent additions to the hive, the missing hikers from last month. Their bodies still in the process of being integrated into the system, their eyes tracked us. Blinking desperately. "Help us." My heart was failing. The stimulants had pushed my system too far. Zeus and Apollo weren't in better shape. Their breathing was labored, muscles trembling. We had maybe minutes left. Time, 04:27 final observation. Organism weakness identified. Integration process requires intact nervous system. Potential solution, terminal. 20 years of putting down suffering animals had taught me the hardest lesson of medicine. Sometimes death is the kindest escape. I pulled out my last 3 syringes, loaded with enough barbiturates to stop a horse's heart. "I'm sorry," I whispered to the trapped hikers. Then, with practiced precision, I injected their IV lines with the euthanasia solution. The effect was immediate as their hearts stopped. The tissue around us convulsed. The organism's neural network, trying to maintain its connection to the dying brains, went into shock. The membrane walls spasmed, tearing open. Cold surface air rushed in. Zeus and Apollo, with their last strength, lunged through the gap. I followed, my own heart barely beating. We collapsed on the actual cave floor, near the original entrance as dawn broke over the park. Behind us, something massive shifted beneath the earth. A sound like a mountain crying out in pain echoed through the ground. Then silence. I woke up 3 days later in the University of Kentucky Medical Center. Multiple organ failure, they said. Zeus and Apollo were in the veterinary IQ, alive but forever changed. Our hearts still occasionally try to sync with rhythms that shouldn't exist. The park service found my Arv, torn apart not by animals, but from the inside out. The cave entrance had collapsed, declared unsafe due to unexpected geological activity. My YouTube channel was terminated after dozens of viewers reported seizures from watching the final stream. But that's not why I'm writing this. Yesterday, I treated a dog at my new clinic in Colorado. Normal checkup, until I used my stethoscope. Its heartbeat was synced to a rhythm I recognized when I checked its eyes. I saw patterns moving in the retina, DNA sequences. It had come from a rescue in Kentucky. The organism isn't dead, it's spreading, using animals as vectors, hibernating in their neural pathways, waiting to establish new nodes. So this is my warning. If you're camping near any cave system and your pets start acting strange, synchronized movements, staring at things you can't see, run. Don't try to record it. Don't try to study it. And most importantly, don't follow them if they try to lead you inside. Some things in nature aren't meant to be healed or understood, just contained. Final report, Dr. Marcus Doc Foster, former host Node, Number 274 Mammoth Cave Collective PS. If you're reading this and your heartbeat feels like it's trying to sync with something else's rhythm, remember, chaos is your only escape.